Chapter 4459. The people of Qingyu Hall have gone too far. Marshals will put down Ji Tianqing's jade slip and slammed the table angrily. From his point of view, Feiyang Shenwang and the other heavenly generals were in the wrong. Once he figured out what had happened, he would definitely punish them severely. However, before Feiyang Shenwang and the other heavenly generals could explain what had happened and return to the fleet, they were ambushed by Qingyu Hall. What was this? Qingyu Hall did not take him seriously at all, nor did they care about the dignity of the Prajna God Emperor. Too arrogant, too presumptuous. When my soldiers made a mistake, I should naturally investigate and punish them. Since when did you bastards have the right to overstep your bounds and meddle in my affairs? Marshals were cursed angrily. The other heavenly generals beside him were also filled with righteous indignation and began to ask questions. Marshal, the Hall Master of the Pure Moon Hall, sent troops to kill our officers and soldiers to avenge her people when she saw that we didn't admit our mistakes. She didn't take us seriously at all. This is not just an insult to us, it is a disgrace to the Prajna God Emperor. The Master of Qingyu Hall has sent soldiers to kill our soldiers before the truth of the matter is clear. Isn't this silencing us? Marshal, please give the order. I am willing to lead soldiers to rescue our soldiers. I am also willing to lead soldiers to rescue our brothers. I will not let the Master of Qingyu Hall's scheme succeed, and I will not disgrace the Prajna God Emperor. Marshal Zhou was both angry and helpless at the situation. The Master of Qingyu Hall was obviously going to make a big deal out of this. Even if he were to lower his status and negotiate with the Master of Qingyu Hall, the Master of Qingyu Hall would not let this matter rest. In fact, he was afraid that the Master of Qingyu Hall would make things worse. The only thing he could do now was to send out elite troops to rescue Feiyang Shenwang and his soldiers. Marshal Zhou immediately made a decision and ordered, "All 6 generals, listen up. Immediately gather 1,500 soldiers and 300 God King experts. Hurry and rescue God King Feiyang and the others as quickly as possible. Once you arrive at the area of the incident, you will split into 6 groups to search. You will focus on rescuing our officers and soldiers, and try not to get involved with the people of Qingyu Hall. Also, try to minimize casualties during the mission." The 6 divine generals acknowledged the order and hurriedly retreated to gather the troops. They moved very quickly. In just a few short minutes, they had gathered 1,800 soldiers, including 300 God Kings. They left the fleet as fast as lightning. Marshals was stood in the sky above the fleet and watched as the soldiers flew across the sky and disappeared into the horizon. He thought to himself, I hope everything is not too late. Even if there are casualties, it should be within an acceptable range. When Feiyang Shenwang and the others return to the fleet, as long as Qingyu Hall doesn't report this to the higher-ups, I will negotiate with them again. Previously, Marshal Zhou was indeed too arrogant. He thought that he could belittle Qingyu Hall just because he had the support of the Prajna God Emperor. After all, Qingyu Hall had always been very friendly, respectful and humble. However, Marshal Zhou did not expect the Master of Qingyu Hall to be so unyielding. He was really angry after a failed negotiation and wanted to start a war. Marshal Zhou had always thought that both sides did not want to make a big deal out of this. Otherwise, both sides would be punished. Now it seemed that he still did not understand Qingyu Hall well enough. Now that things had developed to this point, he could only pray that the situation would not worsen. Ji Tianqing noticed that Qingyu Hall's team of God Kings had replied to Marshal Zhou's message and turned around to look for the 2 groups of soldiers who were mining the ore veins. The 2 groups of soldiers had a total of more than 260 people. They were happily mining the ore veins and plundering the resources and treasures. When they received Ji Tianqing's order, they did not dare to delay. They immediately stopped their mining operations, gathered together and returned to the fleet. One group was in the southeast while the other was in the southwest. However, after flying for 2 million miles, the 2 groups met up. At this moment, Ji Tianqing also rushed over as fast as he could. However, he remained invisible and did not reveal himself. Instead, he secretly followed the 200 soldiers as they returned to the fleet. He had already predicted that this group of soldiers would encounter Qingyu Hall's team of God Kings in about 4 hours. At that time, the 2 sides would definitely engage in a fierce battle. When Marshal Zhou received his message and sent his elite soldiers to rescue them, it would take at least 8 hours for them to arrive. There was a 4-hour gap in between. If he did not lend a hand, his team would definitely be defeated. Of course, Ji Tianxing was more willing to believe that Qing Yu Hall was not here to silence them, but to capture the murderer. If Qing Yu Hall succeeded, they would definitely capture the murderer and bring him back to Seven Moon Mountain. After interrogating him, they would confront Marshal Zhou. At that time, the master of Qing Yu Hall would negotiate with Marshal Zhou again. Marshal Zhou probably did not want to make a big deal out of this and would most likely compromise. If he allowed them to minimize the problem, then all of Ji Tianxing's previous efforts would have been in vain. Therefore he could not let Qing Yu Hall succeed. He had to observe the battle from the shadows. Once he realized that the situation was not good, he had to intervene immediately. He thought to himself that the best outcome would be he would take advantage of the chaotic battle and kill all of Qing Yu Hall's team of god kings. That way the Prajna fleet would cause even more trouble and Qing Yu Hall would be completely enraged. The conflict between the two sides would escalate to a point where it could not be resolved. Swoosh, swoosh. More than 200 soldiers flew across the sky as fast as lightning with uneasy hearts. They only wanted to return to the fleet as quickly as possible. They knew that Qing Yu Hall had sent a large group of god kings to kill them. This time they were doomed. They had just collected a large amount of resources and treasures, and they had not had the time to enjoy them yet. If they were killed by Qing Yu Hall, it would be too humiliating. Ji Tianxing remained invisible and followed behind the team at a moderate pace. He was constantly paying attention to his surroundings. Things were progressing smoothly just as he expected. 4 hours later, in the sky above a primitive forest, Ji Tianxing's team clashed with Qing Yu Hall's team of god kings. Thankfully it was only one team. There were only about 100 desolate race god kings. When the two sides clashed, the 100 desolate race god kings became excited and agitated. They let out angry roars and roars. They immediately unsheathed their sabers. The Kenshin soldiers charged at Ji Tianxing's team with murderous intent. The 200 desolate race soldiers were somewhat flustered. They were shocked by the god king's aura, so they hurriedly changed directions and fled. Previously, Ji Tianxing had warned them not to clash head-on with the Qing Yu Hall's experts. They were also not to engage in unnecessary fights and to prioritize their survival. Even though the 200 soldiers had fled hundreds of thousands of miles away, they were still caught up by the Qing Yu Hall's god kings. However, these soldiers managed to delay them for at least 15 minutes. Chapter 4460. The development of the situation was completely in line with Ji Tianxing's expectations. The master of Qing Yu Hall and marshals thought that they were in control of the situation. But in reality, the person who was in control of the situation was Ji Tianxing. He stood in the sky while invisible, watching the 100 desolate race godly kings attack the 260 soldiers. He waited patiently. The two sides did not communicate much, nor did they need to communicate. The battle began immediately. Although the Qing Yu Hall had fewer people, they had the advantage in terms of strength. They were all godly king experts. Hence they spread out and formed an encirclement that spanned 1,000 miles. They surrounded the 260 soldiers in the middle. More than 100 desolate race godly kings wielded different types of divine weapons and used their full strength to attack the 200 soldiers. The 200 soldiers were flustered and worried, but they did not lose their composure. Under the leadership of more than a dozen godly generals, the soldiers quickly calmed down. They formed a battle formation in an orderly manner and joined forces to defend against the enemy's fierce attacks. Swish, swish, swish. Colorful divine lights lit up. Hundreds of divine powers covered the sky as they clashed violently. Boom! A deafening explosion reverberated across a radius of 20,000 miles. It shook the mountains and the ground. The shockwaves from the collisions of various divine abilities and spell techniques transformed into a series of 5-colored halos that proliferated like ripples, destroying the primordial forest around them. The two sides had just exchanged 2 or 3 blows when Ji Tianxing's 200 soldiers suffered casualties. More than a dozen godly lord warriors were struck by the divine powers and mystic techniques of the desolate race godly kings. Blood splattered everywhere as they let out shrill cries. A few of the godly lords had their bodies destroyed as they exploded into a bloody mist. The other godly lords suffered even worse fates. Not only were their bodies destroyed, even their godheads were shattered. They died instantly. The appearance of casualties infuriated the 250 soldiers. They were shocked and angry. They roared angrily and cursed loudly. They no longer held back their strength and used all their strength to counterattack. On the other hand, the God Kings of Qingyu Hall did not have much experience in battle, but they possessed tremendous strength. Naturally, they continued to attack calmly. Rumble. Another series of explosions rang out, and dazzling five-colored divine light shrouded the area within a radius of 5,000 kilometers. The battle between the two sides soon reached a white-hot climax, showing the most intense state. As time passed, every few breaths at least one Flood Tribe soldier would be killed. On the other hand, only a few of the 100 God Kings in Qingyu Hall suffered light injuries. None of them were seriously injured and did not affect the battle. The 200 or so Hong tribe soldiers despaired at this sight. It couldn't be helped. Even if they had twice the number of people, it was useless. The other party's strength was too strong. Just 100 divine king powerhouses were enough to defeat them or even kill them all. However, all the soldiers knew that Qingyu Hall had sent more than 100 God Kings. There were even more God King teams that were hurrying over. Thinking of this, the 15 divine generals and many soldiers could not help but curse. Those bastards from Qingyu Hall, they really want to kill us all. Just 100 desolate race God Kings are enough to defeat us. Furthermore, they have sent even more God Kings. Qingyu Hall is so vicious and merciless. Are they trying to declare war on our entire fleet? Even if we die here, we have to send the news back and let Marshal Zhou know the truth. We cannot die for nothing. We have to get Marshal Zhou to avenge us. While the soldiers were casting spells to defend themselves, two divine generals took the opportunity to take out their communication jade slips and sent a message to Marshal Zhou, anxiously asking for help. Unknowingly, 45 minutes passed. None of the 100 God Kings in Qingyu Hall had died. Only about a dozen of them had suffered light injuries. On the other hand, more than 60 of the 200 soldiers had been killed. There were only about 190 left and most of them were injured. These soldiers had tried to break out of the encirclement many times, but to no avail. Even the 15 divine generals had suffered injuries. Ji Tianxing had been watching the battle in secret. He could not help but feel disappointed when he saw this scene. I thought that no matter how weak these 200 soldiers were, they would be able to escape the encirclement of the 100 God Kings and continue to stall for time. I did not expect them to be so weak. If this goes on, they will be killed and captured by the 100 God Kings. For the sake of the follow-up plan, Ji Tianxing decided not to watch any longer. He retreated tens of thousands of miles before revealing himself. He pretended to be in a hurry and rushed to the battlefield. When he arrived near the battlefield, the 100 God Kings and the 200 soldiers of Qingyu Hall noticed him. Immediately, some of the soldiers cheered excitedly, "Feiyang Shenwang is here. He is finally back." Unfortunately, most of the soldiers remained indifferent and could not get excited. From their point of view, so what if Feiyang Shenwang rushed back? He would only be sending himself to his death if he came alone. There was no way he could turn the tide of the battle. The 100 God Kings of Qingyu Hall also noticed Ji Tianxing. They did not think much of him and continued to attack the soldiers. Ji Tianxing pretended to be angry as he brandished his divine sword with murderous intent. He charged at the desolate race God Kings without any regard for his own safety. He shouted loudly, "Brothers, do not be afraid. Our reinforcements will be here soon." Compared to his arrival, these words had a greater effect. Immediately, the gloomy eyes of the soldiers who were filled with despair were reignited with hope. Strangely enough, the soldiers rallied their spirits and tried their best to cast spells to defend. Indeed, it was effective as they blocked the fierce attacks of the God Kings. As for Ji Tianxing, he was also extremely ferocious. He fought 3 desolate race God Kings alone and he was able to quickly injure and kill them. This was the result of him deliberately suppressing his strength and only using 10% of his strength. If he had relaxed a little, he could have inadvertently killed a few desolate race God Kings. That would have been too shocking. As time passed, one desolate race God King after another died under Ji Tianxing's burial of heaven. Those who were lucky enough to survive were also severely injured by him. They had no choice but to retreat to the side and circulate their energy to suppress their injuries. The battle was too intense and Ji Tianxing's performance was too shocking. So much so that everyone had overlooked or rather failed to notice the invisible pressure between heaven and earth. That invisible pressure suppressed the God Kings of Qingyu Hall, greatly reducing their strength. 3579 Ji Tianxing was invincible as he used all sorts of Sword Dao divine powers. With his perfect sword techniques he killed one desolate race god king after another. The god kings of Qingyu Hall began to panic. They no longer dared to underestimate him. The leading elder and 2 deacons had the strength of a high-level god king. They hurriedly gave up on attacking the soldiers and turned to attack Ji Tianxing. Chapter 4461. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Ji Tianxing did not want to appear too heaven-defying. If he really killed the Qingyu Hall's elder and 2 deacons in one strike, it would be too eye-catching and would definitely arouse suspicion. Hence he pretended that he was no match for the Qingyu Hall's elder and 2 deacons. His clothes were tattered and his body was covered in blood. He looked extremely pathetic. Since he was no match for the Qingyu Hall, he could not put up a front. Ji Tianxing charged into the crowd, using more than 100 soldiers as cover. He was the leader of the soldiers and he had performed so bravely. Seeing him being pursued by the Qingyu Hall's elder and deacons, a few divine generals naturally came to his rescue. As such, Ji Tianxing temporarily escaped from the entanglement of the 3 desolate race godly monarchs. He took advantage of the chaos to use his divine powers and assassinate a few desolate race godly monarchs. After a while, the few divine generals were no match for the Qingyu Hall's elder and deacons. They were also forced to retreat. At this moment, Ji Tianxing took advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention to secretly injure the 2 deacons. A few divine generals took the opportunity and rushed forward, turning the 2 deacons into minced meat. Only the elder of the Pure Moon Hall was left. Besieged by several immortal generals, it was difficult for him to stand alone and was forced to retreat. Ji Tianxing continued to roam the battlefield, his movements erratic. He quickly killed one desolate race godly monarch after another. Finally an hour passed. Then something amazing happened. Previously, the Qingyu Hall's team had the upper hand, causing the soldiers led by Ji Tianxing to retreat in defeat. But now the Qingyu Hall's team only had about 30 people left alive. The other 60 desolate race godly monarchs had been killed. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing's subordinates, who had more than 190 people when he joined the battle, were left with more than 170 people. The Qingyu Hall's elder who led the team was also heavily injured. His strength had greatly decreased. He finally sensed that something was off and discovered that the number of divine king powerhouses under his command had decreased sharply. If they continued to fight, they would most likely be completely annihilated and buried here. Even though he couldn't understand why there was such a huge gap between the 2 of them. The other party had only sent a 7th stage realm high-level god king to join the battle. How could he overturn the situation? However, now was not the time to think about this. He could only decisively order the remaining god kings to withdraw from the battle and return to 7 Moon Mountain. As for the task of capturing this batch of criminals, it could only be handed over to the other 4 teams. At the beginning of the battle, this Qingyu Hall elder had sent a message to the other 4 teams, asking them to hurry over and provide support. Calculating the time, it would take another 30 to 30 minutes for the nearest team to arrive. With the Qingyu Hall elder giving the order, more than 30 desolate race godly monarchs retreated as they rapidly flew towards the north. However, it was not easy for them to retreat from the battlefield and gather their troops. Ji Tianxing led more than 170 soldiers to pester them, taking the opportunity to launch a counterattack in pursuit. The situation was completely reversed. The 30 over desolate race godly monarchs were filled with grief, anger and helplessness. Previously they were in control of the situation and completely suppressed the other party. Now they were utterly defeated by the other party and had to flee. This was too ironic. Even so, they could only flee with all their might. As they fled, they resisted the pursuit of Ji Tianxing and company. In this way, the Qingyu Hall's desolate race godly monarchs paid the price of another 9 godly monarchs' lives to finally escape the pursuit of Ji Tianxing and company. Originally, according to Ji Tianxing's plan, he wanted to kill all the desolate race godly monarchs. However, the 100 over soldiers under him were either lightly or heavily injured. Furthermore, they had expended too much of their god power, causing their battle strength to drop significantly. With just these soldiers, it was impossible for them to kill all the godly monarchs of Qingyu Hall. Ji Tianxing could not appear to be too monstrous. He could only pretend to be heavily injured and weak as he rushed back to the fleet with the rest. The soldiers did not dare to let down their guard. As they consumed divine pills to suppress their injuries, they increased their speed and remained vigilant of their surroundings. Ji Tianxing appeared unperturbed as he led everyone to rush back. However, he knew very well that it would be very difficult for this batch of soldiers to return to the fleet alive. It would not be long before a second batch of desolate race godly monarchs came to kill them. Just as expected. The soldiers had just escaped 800,000 miles when a 100-man team chased after them from the side. Everyone could tell at a glance that the team was made up of Qin Yu Hall's desolate race godly monarchs. They were coming for them. This team of desolate race godly monarchs had already received the news. They knew that the first team had suffered heavy casualties and had fled in a sorry state. They were shocked by the powerful strength of the culprit. They were even more fearful and hated the culprit even more. They locked onto the position of Ji Tianxing and company and flew over at a moderate speed. They quickly formed a wall and blocked the path of Ji Tianxing and company. The 170-odd soldiers were flustered. They were filled with anxiety and worry. After the previous battle, they were already at the end of their tether. Now that they were being attacked by 100 desolate race godly monarchs, their outcome was bound to be tragic. It was impossible for them to face them head-on. The soldiers could only change their direction and break out from the side. However, the 100 desolate race godly monarchs came prepared. How could they let them escape successfully? The two sides quickly collided fiercely in the sky. They fought fiercely in the sky and an earth-shattering sound burst out. One side wanted to survive while the other side wanted revenge. Everyone used all their strength to use their divine powers and ultimate techniques, engaging in the most intense battle possible. Hundreds of divine powers and spells, as well as tens of thousands of saber beams and sword shadows, clashed intensely in the sky, producing dazzling beams of light. Violent shock waves spread out like colorful ripples, sweeping through a radius of 5,000 miles. Mountains and lands were destroyed, rivers were severed, and primordial forests were reduced to ashes. The scene of the battle was somewhat chaotic, but it was also extremely intense. At this point, the 100-plus soldiers under Ji Tianxing's command were completely at a disadvantage. They were being suppressed miserably. Everyone's attention was focused on the battle and their survival, so no one noticed the situation of others. This was the moment for Ji Tianxing to perform. He took advantage of the chaos to kill one desolate race godly monarch after another, secretly collecting many divine spark fragments. Of course, what he wanted to do was not to kill all the desolate race godly monarchs, but to control the situation. He wanted to make the desolate race godly monarchs suffer heavy losses, while losing more than half of his own soldiers, but he could not allow them to be completely wiped out. The development of the situation and the final outcome was naturally smooth, and it was completely within his control. Both sides fought and tangled for an hour. After another 15 minutes of pursuit, he finally struggled to lead the soldiers out of the encirclement. In the end, 120 out of the 170-odd soldiers were killed, leaving only about 50 soldiers alive. Of the 100-plus desolate race godly monarchs in Qin Yu Hall, more than 40 were killed and about a dozen were heavily injured. This was truly a situation where both sides suffered heavy losses. The number of casualties on both sides increased, and the enmity between them became more and more stable. It could no longer be resolved. Chapter 4462. Ji Tianxing led the 50 surviving soldiers and continued fleeing towards the Pan-Rua fleet. They had already encountered 2 Qin Yu Hall godly monarch teams, and they had suffered terrible casualties. However, they had also paid a terrible price. The 50 surviving soldiers were all heavily injured. Their bodies were covered in blood and their clothes were in tatters. There were also a few divine lord warriors who were on the brink of death. Such a tragic outcome caused everyone's morale to plummet and they were dispirited. Previously, they were still thinking that if they could survive the 2 desolate race godly monarch teams, they would have a chance of escaping back to the fleet alive. However, after experiencing the 2 assassination attempts, they were in despair. Although they were only 4 million miles away from the fleet, they no longer had any hope or confidence of returning alive. Every soldier had a premonition that Qin Yu Hall was determined to kill them. The godly monarch teams sent to kill them were definitely not just the 2 teams. With their strength, it was unbelievable that they could escape the pursuit of 200 desolate race godly monarchs. It was like a miracle. Perhaps they would encounter a 3rd desolate race godly monarch team in the next moment. In their present state, unless a miracle happened, they would definitely die without a burial ground. The soldiers could only pray silently, hoping that the reinforcements sent by Marshal Zhou would arrive as soon as possible. Only this slim chance of survival could save them. In fact, the other 3 godly monarch teams from Qingyu Hall had missed Ji Tianxing and company. When they learned that the 2 teams had suffered heavy casualties, they hurriedly turned north, chasing after the criminals as fast as they could. The mission was simple and the goal was very clear. That was, they had to capture the 50 criminals before they could escape back to the Pan-Rua fleet. Thankfully, the distance between the 2 parties was not far. The 3rd Desolate Race Godly Monarch team chased north for an hour before they caught up to Ji Tianxing and company. Swish, swish. When the distance between the 2 parties was less than 50,000 miles, the Desolate Race Godly Monarchs in Qingyu Hall did not hesitate to release divine light that filled the sky, shooting it at Ji Tianxing and company. The 5-colored divine light that blotted out the sky was not meant to kill Ji Tianxing and the others, but to form a light shield that suppressed the heavens and earth, suppressing and imprisoning Ji Tianxing and the others. The reason for this was because the master of Qingyu Hall, who was in charge of 7th Moon Mountain, had given the order after learning about the battle. We can't kill anymore. If we kill the remaining 50 murderers, how are we going to force them to confess? No matter what, we must keep him alive and bring him back to Mount 7 Moons. It was this order that made the 100 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs hesitate to kill him. Whoosh, swish. Thousands of 5-colored divine lights quickly gathered in the sky, forming a light shield with a radius of 10,000 miles, enveloping Ji Tianxing and the others. The ball-like 5-colored light shield rapidly contracted and shrunk. It also released a powerful force that suppressed the 50 soldiers. The soldiers, who were already on the brink of death, could no longer hold on. Their divine bodies exploded from the suppression and their divine sparks shattered, killing them instantly. As such, before the Desolate Race Godly Monarchs could even draw their weapons, Ji Tianxing had lost another 8 soldiers. The 42 soldiers that were lucky enough to survive had the strength of a godly monarch, but their injuries were very tragic. After being suppressed by the 5-colored light shield, these soldiers found it difficult to move. Their strength was greatly suppressed and they could no longer use any combat strength. When the 100 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs arrived near the light shield, half of the godly monarchs joined forces to cast spells to strengthen the 5-colored light shield. The 42 soldiers could only surrender and await their deaths. Ka. As the 50 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs cast their spells, the 5-colored light shield with a radius of 10,000 miles constantly shrank. The light shield became more solid and thick. As the invisible suppressive force grew stronger, the 42 soldiers struggled less and less. Gradually, no one was able to put up any effective resistance. Even though Ji Tianxing could turn the tables and break the 5-colored light shield at any time, killing the 100 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs. However, he had to pretend to be weak and powerless so he could not display his true strength. After all, the 50 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs were in charge of casting spells to suppress them, while the other 50 Godly Monarchs were prepared to capture them. Most importantly, he had calculated the time. The elite reinforcements sent by Marshal Zhou were about to arrive. Everyone, don't be anxious. Those criminals have already been suppressed by us. Their injuries are very serious, so they will soon lose the ability to resist. Listen to my orders. Once I give the order, you can enter the array to capture them. The leader of the 100 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs, a white-haired Qingyu Hall elder, said in a dignified voice. The 50 Desolate Race Godly Monarchs, armed with Kenshin soldiers, had already spread out. They surrounded the shrinking 5-colored light shield, eyeing it covetously. Upon hearing the elder's orders, everyone replied in unison. They stared fiercely at the soldiers in the light shield, silently accumulating their strength. The 42 soldiers in the light shield thought that they were doomed and were about to be dismembered by the Desolate Race Godly Monarchs. However, when they heard the Qingyu Hall elders shout, they could not help but heave a sigh of relief. So they don't want to kill us but to capture us. Phew. Our lives shouldn't be in danger for the time being, right? This thought flashed through everyone's minds at the same time. However, the god generals thought further. They immediately realized that the other party wanted to capture them and bring them back to Qingyu Hall to force Marshal Zhou to confess his crimes. Once they could not withstand Qingyu Hall's torture and confess that they had attacked and killed the citizens of Qingyu Hall, then the 90,000 people in the Hanya fleet would be branded as sinners. When that happened, not only would they not be able to survive, They would also implicate all the soldiers. That would be more terrifying than killing them. When they thought of this, the god generals trembled in anger. They wished that they could perish together with the other party. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, 15 minutes had passed. At this moment, the fourth and fifth godly monarchs from Qingyu Hall were also on their way. They were only a few 100,000 miles away. However, the elite reinforcements sent by Marshal Zhou had arrived before them. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. In the northern sky, 3 majestic divine warships were rushing over at lightning speed, dragging long tails of divine light behind them. In just a few breaths' time, the 3 divine warships arrived above the 5-colored light shield. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The cabin doors of the 3 divine warships quickly opened. Countless figures clad in armor and wielding swords rushed out of the divine warships and formed a battle formation in the sky. In the blink of an eye, the 3 divine warships formed a battle formation in the sky, surrounding the 5-colored light shield and the 100 desolate race godly monarchs. The desolate race godly monarchs took a closer look and saw that the 3 divine warships had 900 people. They were all soldiers under the command of the Hanya God Emperor. Chapter 4463. The scene was a little awkward and strange. More than 100 godly kings surrounded Ji Tianqing and the 42 soldiers. They worked together to suppress them to the point that they were unable to resist. However, Marshal Zhou had sent another 900 soldiers as reinforcements. They formed an even larger encirclement and surrounded the godly kings. Although the average strength of the 100 godly kings was stronger. However, Ji Tianqing and company had more than 900 reinforcements, and there were 150 godly kings among them. When these 900 soldiers drew their Kenshin swords and surrounded the godly kings with murderous intent, they immediately panicked. Damn it! Those darn criminals have already sent a message to the fleet for help. It seems like Marshal Zhou is determined to go all the way. He is determined to go against our Qingyu Hall. We only wanted to capture these criminals for interrogation and make them confess to their crimes. We never expected Marshal Zhou to be so cruel and ruthless as to send 900 soldiers to kill us. I told you long ago that these bloody non-humankind beings are greedy, bloodthirsty, and cruel. Now that things have come to this, what else is there to say? The only thing we can do is fight to the last moment and shed our last drop of blood. I want to see whether or not these divine Lord Realm foreign races can withstand this old man's slaughter. With the casualties from both sides were truly enraged. They had completely ignited their anger and hatred. Hence, both sides did not exchange many words. They immediately attacked with all their might and began a massacre. Shwa, 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 shwa. Thousands of divine techniques collided violently in the sky, producing deafening booms and sending divine light fragments everywhere. An incomparably violent shockwave carrying the power to destroy everything spread out in all directions, destroying countless mountains and rivers. In the first round of clashes, neither side gained the upper hand. The 100 godly kings were forced back and had no time to suppress Ji Tianqing and company. As for the 900 soldiers, more than 10 of them were at the Divine Lord realm. They were severely injured and had blood spurting out of their orifices. The stench of fresh blood permeated the air, stimulating everyone's nerves. Everyone no longer held back and unleashed their full strength. Rumble. The second round of battles began again. Thousands of divine abilities and spell techniques clashed fiercely again. Everyone roared furiously, shouting themselves hoarse as they released their divine power without caring about anything else. As such, the 900 soldiers and the 100 desolate race godly monarchs were completely entangled in a battle that was difficult to determine. When both sides fought with all their might, the 100-plus desolate race godly monarchs could no longer suppress Ji Tianqing and company. The pressure on Ji Tianqing and the 42 soldiers was greatly reduced. They quickly circulated their energy to suppress their injuries or took some divine pills to heal their injuries. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Ji Tianqing called on everyone to cast spells together to attack the 5-colored light barrier and break out of the seal. In fact, he didn't expect those exhausted soldiers to be of much help. If he wanted to break the seal, he would have to rely on his strength and means. The reason why he had so many soldiers cast the spell together was to deceive others. Rumble. Bam, bam, bam. With Ji Tianqing and the soldiers attacking ferociously, all sorts of divine abilities and spell techniques struck the 5-colored light barrier, causing deafening explosions. The divine light barrier formed by the 100-plus desolate race godly monarchs only lasted for 2 seconds before it was shattered by Ji Tianqing's attacks. With a kacha-kacha shattering sound, the 5-colored light barrier shattered into thousands of divine light fragments. They scattered in all directions and fell to the ground. The 100 desolate race godly monarchs finally reacted. They roared angrily as they charged towards Ji Tianqing and company. However, the 900 soldiers continued to pester them. They used all their strength to use their trump cards and ultimate techniques to hold back the desolate race godly monarchs. This bought enough time for Ji Tianqing and company to escape the sealed area of the array and join the 900 soldiers. Originally, the 42 soldiers should have taken the opportunity to escape and rush back to the fleet. However, they had experienced 3 ambushes and were scared out of their wits. How could they dare to escape alone? Now, in their hearts, staying by the side of the reinforcements was the safest option. If they continued to flee to the north, they might encounter a 4th or 5th group that would intercept them. When that happened, who would be able to save them? Hence, the 42 soldiers mixed in with the reinforcements. As they consumed divine pills to recuperate, they joined forces to cast spells to attack the desolate race godly monarchs. As such, the battle quickly entered a tug-of-war. Even though the Bo-Ri God Emperor's soldiers had the advantage, they surrounded the 100 desolate race godly monarchs and completely suppressed them. However, the other party was not weak either. Even though they were at a disadvantage, they could defend with all their might. They could hold on for a long period of time, waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Very quickly, another 15 minutes passed. More than 60 of the 942 soldiers were injured or killed. However, their morale was still high and they attacked ferociously. More than 40 of the 100 desolate race godly monarchs were killed. Half of them were thanks to Ji Tianqing. However, he had done it very discreetly. He had used the hands of others to kill the desolate race godly monarchs. Both sides were in a killing frenzy. No one was willing to retreat. At this moment, another dazzling divine light rushed over from the southwest. When the 5-colored divine light came close, it could be seen that it was more than 100 desolate race godly monarchs. Without a doubt, it was the 4th team from the Qingyu Hull. This team of desolate race godly monarchs had thought that their companions had long finished off the criminals. They had rushed over to clean up the mess and cheer them on. However, they never expected that the criminals that had survived had summoned hundreds of reinforcements. They had surrounded their companions and were attacking them relentlessly. With a cursory glance, the situation was clear. More than 800 Bo-Ri God Emperor's soldiers were at the top. More than 50 desolate race godly monarchs had been beaten to a miserable state. The newly arrived desolate race godly monarchs were immediately enraged. Anger and killing intent burned in their chests. Their hatred for the Bo-Ri God Emperor's soldiers reached its peak. Kill. At this point in time, what's the point of talking about feelings with those bastards from other races? They have killed so many of our clansmen and brothers. We have to kill all of them to take revenge. I believe that at this point in time, capturing the criminals is no longer important. Since we have already shed all pretenses of cordiality, let's fight to the death. Let's see who will emerge victorious. Kill these heartless bastards who bite the hand that feeds them. More than 100 desolate race godly monarchs roared and cursed angrily. They did not need the orders of the leading elder as they brandished their sabers and Kenshin soldiers and launched a fierce attack on the 800 soldiers. As such, the dazzling 5-colored divine light lit up once again. All sorts of divine powers appeared once again. They collided in the sky with deafening booms, producing destructive shockwaves. Chapter 4464. Due to the addition of the 4th desolate race godly monarch team, the battle did not end. Instead, it became even more intense. The scene of the bloody battle became even more tragic. The loud booms that reverberated throughout the world became even more deafening. Even the shockwaves that constantly spread out, reaching a radius of tens of thousands of miles, became even more dazzling. The Divine Lord warriors under the Bo-Ri God Emperor were naturally the first to bear the brunt of the attack. They suffered the heaviest casualties. On average, for every desolate race godly monarch that was killed, there were 4 or 5 Divine Lord warriors that died. As the number of casualties on both sides increased, the hatred between them also increased, becoming deeply rooted. Ji Tianqing could stop everything, but he could also change everything. However, he chose to hide and secretly control everything. He tried his best to maintain the balance of power between both sides. Another quarter of an hour passed. The Bo-Ri God Emperor had more than 800 soldiers, but another 200 had died. There were only about 600 left. As for the desolate race godly monarchs on the battlefield, from the initial 150 people, there were now only about 60 of them. Another 90 desolate race godly monarchs had died tragically in the chaotic battle, turning to dust. From the situation, it was obvious that the desolate race godly monarchs of the Qingyu Hall had been defeated. However, the soldiers under Pan Ruo Divine Emperor's command also paid a very heavy price. Of the 600 surviving soldiers, most of them were heavily injured. Many of their robes were stained with blood and they were riddled with wounds. Their strength had greatly decreased. If the 60 desolate race godly monarchs that survived did not hesitate to sacrifice their lives to break out of the encirclement, they would definitely be able to drag down 300 soldiers with them. However, the 60 desolate race godly monarchs still had hope in their hearts. They did not dare to make such a decisive decision. This was because the 5th desolate race godly monarch team had arrived. This was the last team sent by the master of Qingyu Hall. It was still 100 desolate race godly monarchs, led by an elder and 2 deacons. Before they arrived at the battlefield, they had already received messages from a few teams. They roughly knew the outcome of the battle. These desolate race godly monarchs were extremely shocked. They could not believe that the soldiers under the Bo-Ri God Emperor had such terrifying combat strength. However, after they rushed to the battlefield and witnessed the situation with their own eyes, they had no choice but to believe it. The miserable scene of hundreds of people in ragged clothes and covered in blood shocked them inexplicably. The mountains and rivers within a radius of 60,000 miles had been reduced to ruins and dust, which made them sigh with emotion. When they saw their former clansmen and companions had been obliterated or were on the verge of death, they felt indescribably sorrowful and furious, and their killing intent surged into the sky. Hence, the 100 desolate race godly monarchs also let out angry roars and roars. They brandished their sabers and brandished the Kenshin soldiers without regard for anything else as they joined the battle. The great battle that had paused for a moment with great difficulty once again set off a storm of blood, reaching its peak. The more than 60 desolate race godly monarchs, who were riddled with injuries, were in high spirits. They boosted their morale as they fought alongside their new companions. Not to be outdone, the 600 soldiers had no time to rest and adjust their breathing. They could only unleash the last of their potential and continue fighting. Perhaps this battle would only need an hour to end. After all, no matter how many soldiers there were under the Bo-Ri God Emperor, their strength had been greatly reduced and they were riddled with injuries. As for the desolate race godly monarchs under the Qingyu Hall, they were extremely powerful and their divine powers were brilliant. In at most an hour the outcome of the battle would be decided. One side would definitely be defeated and flee in a sorry state. However, under Ji Tianxing's manipulation and adjustments, the battle had dragged on for 2 hours without ending. Every time the desolate race godly monarchs of the Qingyu Hall were at a disadvantage and were beaten to a pulp, he would deliberately interfere with his own soldiers, causing them to miss out on a good opportunity. As such, the number and speed of the desolate race godly monarchs' deaths were all under his control. Every time the desolate race godly monarchs of the Qingyu Hall launched a counterattack, suppressing the Bo-Ri God Emperor's soldiers and massacring them, Ji Tianxing would secretly adjust the situation. He would secretly cast spells to quickly finish off some of the troublesome desolate race godly monarchs, reducing the pressure on the hundreds of soldiers. As such, the soldiers and experts from both sides fell deeply into the quagmire of the battle, with no one able to extricate themselves from it. At times, the desolate race godly monarchs of the Qingyu Hall held the upper hand, while at other times, the Bo-Ri God Emperor soldiers controlled the situation. With the passage of time, the battlefield between the two sides constantly pushed northward, getting closer to the fleet and the Seven Moons Mountain. Of course, this was also deliberately done by Ji Tianxing. The reason why he did this was because he wanted to use this fuse to completely ignite the hatred between the two sides, making the situation even more out of control. If one side was defeated, the battle would definitely stop. When that happened, both sides would sound the gong to retreat, and it was very likely that they would begin negotiations again. Once one side calmed down, swallowing their anger and compromising, it would be very difficult for the battle to continue. What Ji Tianxing wanted to do was to continue fanning the flames, causing the battle to continue to erupt until both sides went to war. When that happened, even if the Bo-Ri God Emperor received the news and rushed back as quickly as possible to suppress the situation, it would be too late. In short, he wanted to prevent the Bo-Ri God Emperor from joining the Kongming Temple. 2 hours later, more than half of the 100-plus desolate race godly monarchs of the Qinyu Hall were dead. Only about 60 of them were still bitterly holding on. These godly monarch experts were all at least at the 5th layer of the godly king realm. Even if they were covered in injuries, they could still continue fighting. However, they had a premonition that the situation was not good, and they were also worried that they would all be wiped out. As such, a few elders and deacons tried all means to send out messages to the master of Qinyu Hall for help, hoping that the master of Qinyu Hall would send more experts to reinforce them. When the master of Qinyu Hall, who presided over the Seven Moons Mountain, heard that the 5 teams he sent out had suffered such heavy casualties, he was naturally extremely shocked and flew into a rage. In his rage, the master of Qinyu Hall found it difficult to maintain his composure. For the sake of fairness and justice, as well as to redress the grievances and redeem his reputation, he could only send out more elite experts to reinforce his people. As for the soldiers under the Bo-Ri God Emperor, after 2 hours of fighting, their numbers had been reduced from 600 to about 100. More than 400 soldiers had died tragically in the battle. 90% of them were godly lord warriors, and only a few were godly monarch experts. Even so, the 100-plus soldiers that were lucky enough to survive did not collapse. This was because Marshal Zhou had sent 6 teams of reinforcements, with a total of 1,800 people. After such a long period of time, the other 3 teams of 900 soldiers had also arrived on the battlefield. As such, the Bo-Ri God Emperor had more than 1,000 soldiers on his side. The 60-plus desolate race godly monarchs of the Qinyu Hall who were lucky enough to survive were completely flustered. They could not hold on any longer and could only try their best to break out of the encirclement and escape in the direction of the Seven Moons Mountain. Although Marshal Zhou had sent out 1,000 soldiers to pursue and kill the desolate race godly monarchs one after another, the distance between the 2 sides was very far. They were getting closer and closer to the fleet in the Seven Moons Mountain. This resulted in reinforcements from both sides arriving even faster. Chapter 4465. Under Ji Tianxing's control, the battle between the 2 sides became endless and never-ending. Qinyu Hall's 60-odd desolate race godly monarchs had only managed to escape 1,000,000 miles before more than 40 of them were killed. The remaining 20 godly monarchs were also covered in wounds. They were on the brink of collapse and death. Of the 1,000 soldiers under Marshal Zhou, dozens of them had died in the battle. Only 1,000 were left. However, these 1,000 soldiers were excited and spirited. They swore to capture the 20 surviving desolate race godly monarchs. It was not for any other reason but to capture them back to the fleet and force them to confess. Qinyu Hall had sent out a large number of desolate race godly monarchs to capture the soldiers and bring them back to Seven Moons Mountain for interrogation. This way the soldiers could be proven guilty. In this way, Qinyu Hall would have the moral advantage and condemn the soldiers under the Bo-Ri God Emperor. However, both sides had suffered heavy casualties from the battle up to this point. The soldiers sent out by Marshal Zhou followed suit. They captured the Qinyu Hall's godly monarchs and brought them back to the fleet for interrogation. Even if they could not prove the crimes committed by Qinyu Hall, they could at least use the desolate race godly monarchs as leverage to threaten Qinyu Hall. In short, at this point both sides could no longer give in. The 20 surviving desolate race godly monarchs had their strength greatly reduced. It was difficult for them to escape the pursuit of the 1,000 soldiers and they were about to lose their lives. At the most critical moment, another group of desolate race godly monarchs flew across the sky and appeared in front of everyone. They were more than 200 citizens of Qinyu Hall. Most of them were at the godly monarch realm, but most of them were low-level godly monarchs. They were the reinforcements sent by the master of Qinyu Hall after receiving the news. The 20 dying desolate race godly monarchs were immediately filled with hope and excitement when they saw more than 200 of their people coming to their rescue. They stimulated their potential for survival, unleashed the last of their strength and rushed north regardless of everything. When the 200-plus desolate race godly monarchs from Qinyu Hall saw that their companions were severely injured, they unleashed all their strength and launched a fierce attack on Ji Tianxing and the soldiers. Swish, swish. Dazzling divine light shone as the two sides engaged in a fierce battle in the sky. The 1,000 soldiers who were seething with killing intent were blocked by more than 200 desolate race godly monarchs, causing their pursuit to slow down. Taking this opportunity, the 20 desolate race godly monarchs that were riddled with injuries finally managed to escape their pursuers. They were smart. While taking pills and circulating their martial arts to suppress their injuries, they continued to flee. Because they knew very well that with their current injuries and state, even if they stayed, they wouldn't be of much use. Instead, they would be a burden to their clansmen. They should cherish the opportunity created by their clansmen. After escaping, they should hurry back to 7 Moon Mountain and report the real situation to the master of Qingyu Hall. Just like that, more than 200 desolate race godly monarchs blocked Ji Tianqing and company as they engaged in a fierce battle high in the sky. The 20 desolate race godly monarchs took advantage of the chaos to escape, quickly disappearing into the horizon. Logically speaking, Ji Tianqing and the 1,000 soldiers had the advantage in numbers, so they should have been able to defeat the 200+ desolate race godly monarchs. Even if they couldn't defeat them, they could at least protect themselves and retreat to the fleet. After all, the battlefield where the two sides were fighting was only 2 million miles away from the fleet. They could return in about 2 hours. However, Ji Tianqing would not allow things to develop in this way. If the soldiers escaped back to the fleet, the desolate race godly monarchs would also return to 7 Moon Mountain, making it difficult for the two sides to continue fighting. Following that, the matter would most likely blow up and the Kongming Temple would be the judge. As such, Ji Tianqing secretly stirred up trouble, causing many of the soldiers to be unable to use much of their combat strength. Soon they showed signs of defeat. There were casualties among the 200+ desolate race godly monarchs, but the numbers were small and within a manageable range. On the other hand, the soldiers sent by marshals suffered heavy casualties, and their numbers were greatly reduced. In just 30 minutes of fighting, more than 200 soldiers had been killed by the desolate race godly monarchs. As for the desolate race godly monarchs, only a few dozen of them were injured and less than 10 of them died. If this situation continued, it was estimated that in another 2 hours of fighting, half of the desolate race godly monarchs would be left, while the 1,000 soldiers would be wiped out. Of course, Ji Tianqing would secretly control the situation so that neither side would be completely wiped out. With him around, he could ensure that there would always be people from both sides participating in the battle. He would constantly attract more reinforcements to join the battle, allowing the war to continue expanding. The master of Qingyu Hall, who presided over 7 Moon Mountain, and Marshal Zhou, who presided over the fleet, were both filled with anxiety and anger. The two commanders were constantly receiving news from their subordinates, so they were aware of the latest battle situation, as well as the number of casualties among their soldiers. Both sides were truly enraged, and neither side was willing to give in or admit defeat. Ignoring the fact that they wanted to avenge their soldiers, and ignoring the fact that they wanted to maintain their status and authority in the future, they had to fight this battle for their dignity and integrity. Qingyu Hall had no way out, and they could only fight to the end. As for Marshal Zhu's side, they had already committed a grave mistake and they could not afford to repeat it. If the Prajna God Emperor found out that not only had he committed a grave mistake, but he had also lost the battle against Qingyu Hall, and had even lost thousands of soldiers, he would definitely be severely punished. Since they had already shed all pretenses of cordiality and declared war, they had to win. Therefore, marshals were constantly sent out batches after batches of heavenly generals to lead the elite soldiers on the divine battleships to provide reinforcements. As the battle became more and more intense, the number of soldiers he sent out also increased. From a few hundred at the beginning, to more than 1,000 soldiers, and then to 3,000 soldiers at once. Qingyu Hall was also under great pressure. Although Qingyu Hall was very powerful and had many immortal kings, they could not afford to expend so much resources. However, the battle had already reached its climax and Qingyu Hall could not afford to lose. They had to hold on. Therefore, the master of Qingyu Hall could only send out batches of immortal kings to provide reinforcements after receiving news that their reinforcements had been defeated and had suffered heavy casualties. In the beginning, he sent out a team of 200 soldiers every 2 hours to provide reinforcements. Later, he had to send out a team every 1 hour. Half a day later, the battle had expanded, and there were already thousands of soldiers on both sides fighting each other. The master of Qingyu Hall could only send out a few teams at once. Just like that, a comical scene appeared. 2 million miles away from Seven Moon Mountain and Prajna's fleet, nearly 2,000 elites from both sides were engaged in a bloody battle. More than 1 million miles away from the headquarters of both sides, there were also hundreds of people fighting each other. More than 1,000 people were fighting each other 800,000 miles away from the headquarters of both sides. In the end, the reinforcements sent out by both sides could no longer be bothered to rescue the first batch of people. They left Seven Moon Mountain and the fleet and flew south as fast as lightning. They did not wait for them to arrive at the battlefield. Instead, they met on the way and started fighting without saying a word. This caused the battle between both sides to expand and split into several battlefields. Chapter 4466. As the war expanded, the number of people participating increased. The casualties on both sides also increased rapidly. Gradually, both sides stopped pursuing who was right and who was wrong. This was because at this stage of the war, right and wrong no longer had any meaning. There was only one word left in both sides' eyes: victory. Only by winning could they force the other side to sit down and negotiate. Furthermore, they could seize the initiative. A day passed. The war was still ongoing and it was still in a tense state. It was hard to tell who would win and who would lose. The battlefield had already expanded to 12 locations. Both sides had sent more than 6,000 people to participate in the war. However, this was not the end. The constant reports of casualties on the battlefield stimulated the commanders and soldiers of both sides. It also infuriated the citizens of Mt7 Moons and the 90,000 soldiers in the fleet. The citizens and soldiers of both sides were filled with righteous indignation. They cursed angrily, accusing the other side of being cruel and heartless. If not for the divine generals, elders, and deacons suppressing them, many citizens and soldiers would have rushed out to join the war. Thankfully, the commanders and upper echelons of both sides were able to maintain their restraint and did not lose their rationality. If not, the situation would have long gone out of control. The war would have expanded to a full-scale war. However, this also disappointed Zhi Tianxing. As one of the original culprits, he was now the only survivor. The 300 soldiers that he had brought out to mine the mineral veins and resources had all died. The resources and mineral veins that they mined were lost with their deaths. As the leader, Zhi Tianxing still looked the same as before. His clothes were ragged and his body was covered in blood. His hair was disheveled and his face was dirty. He looked like he was riddled with injuries and could collapse at any moment. But strangely, he had participated in battle after battle. He had directly or indirectly killed many desolate race godly monarchs, but he had never collapsed. What shocked the soldiers even more was that his aura was weak and he was lacking in strength. However, no matter how long the war lasted, he remained the same as before. It was as though he had an inexhaustible amount of divine power. Thankfully, most people were busy fighting. Furthermore, the people who had fought alongside Zhi Tianxing at the beginning had all died in battle. Hence, there were not many people who discovered this. Furthermore, they all died on the battlefield not long after. It was noon on the second day. The war was still ongoing. As both sides continued to send reinforcements, the number of people participating in the battle reached about 10,000. The number of battlefields had also increased to more than 20 locations, from 500,000 li away from Seven Moon Mountain to 1,500,000 li away. Every hundreds of thousands of miles, there would be a battlefield where warriors and civilians from both sides would fight fiercely. The mountains and rivers around the battlefield were destroyed by the aftermath of the battle, turning into scorched earth and ruins. Fortunately, the spatial barrier of the Star of Origin was very sturdy. No matter how hard the God Kings fought, they were unable to create a spatial crack. The thousands of soldiers who had fought alongside Zhi Tianxing had all died in the continuous battles, even though there were still more than 400 soldiers fighting alongside him. However, these soldiers were reinforcements who came later and did not know his performance in the previous battles. More than 400 soldiers joined forces to attack more than 60 desolate race godly monarchs. They were at a disadvantage in the beginning, so their casualties were rather fast. However, Zhi Tianxing had secretly used some means to quickly finish off more than 20 desolate race godly monarchs. As such, with 400 against 40, the soldiers were finally able to stabilize their footing and fight steadily. The situation had developed to this point, and it had basically reached Zhi Tianxing's expectations. He could also retreat after accomplishing his mission. After all, both sides had invested nearly 10,000 people in the battle. Even if they wanted to stop, they could not. At this moment, the leading divine general gave the order for more than 30 soldiers, who were severely injured, to retreat early and return to the fleet to recuperate. Of course, in order to not be intercepted midway, these soldiers had to take a detour. When the leading divine general saw that Ji Tianxing's injuries were too severe, he persuaded him to return to the fleet to recuperate. Ji Tianxing did not decline. He took the opportunity to leave the battlefield with more than 30 soldiers. The group took a huge detour, flying more than 1,000,000 li. It took them more than 2 hours to return to the fleet. However, before Ji Tianxing reached the fleet, he had secretly concealed his tracks and aura, leaving the team. However, more than 30 soldiers in the team were severely injured. They were on the verge of death and their minds were blurry. They could not even take care of themselves. It was not easy for them to force themselves to return to the fleet. Who would notice Ji Tianxing's disappearance? When the 30 soldiers returned to the fleet, they were quickly taken away by the soldiers of the various divine warships. They were sent to recuperate. Ji Tianxing remained invisible. He did not alert anyone and quietly snuck into the Seven Moon Mountain. Previously, he had heard about the current situation from the divine generals who had come to reinforce him. The master of Qingyu Hall and Marshal Zhou were fighting for real. Both sides had sent nearly 10,000 soldiers to participate in the battle. The battlefield had also expanded to more than 20 locations. However, Ji Tianxing knew that this was only temporary. On the surface, it looked very intense, as if he had already achieved his goal. However, in reality, Marshal Zhou and Master of Qingyu Hall were still restraining themselves. As long as more than 80% of the soldiers on both sides were depleted, the battle could end. In particular, the various battlefields were not far from the Seven Moon Mountain and the fleet. They could retreat within 2 hours. Ji Tianxing was also worried that if the Master of Qingyu Hall and Marshal Zhou could not withstand the pressure, and if one side withdrew their soldiers, the battle would end. Therefore, he had to add fuel to the fire and further intensify the conflict between the two sides. The Seven Moon Mountain and the Xianxia fleet were only 100,000 miles apart. However, there were no soldiers from either side within these 100,000 miles. No one was fighting here. From this, it could be seen that both sides were still restraining themselves. They did not have the determination to go to war. Of course, the Xianxia fleet had already entered a state of alert. Their defense had doubled. It was the same on the Seven Moon Mountain. All the citizens were enraged. They were waiting in the city to attack. Hundreds of divine kings led thousands of divine lords to guard the surroundings of the Seven Moon Mountain. They were wary of the Xianxia fleet's sudden attack. After Ji Tianxing entered the Seven Moon Mountain, he did not immediately take action. Instead, he quietly snuck into the most sacred and majestic palace. That was the residence of the Master of Qingyu Hall. It was also the place where he discussed matters with the protectors and elders. When Ji Tianxing found the Master of Qingyu Hall, the Master of Qingyu Hall was in the study. He was discussing matters with 2 protectors and a few elders. The Master of Qingyu Hall's expression was very ugly. His eyes were cold and filled with anger and killing intent. The 2 protectors and a few elders were also furious and filled with killing intent. They were even cursing Marshal Zhou and the others. Ji Tianxing quietly approached the study and quietly listened to their discussion. He quickly understood the Master of Qingyu Hall's state of mind and the choice he was about to make. At this point, we have already sent nearly 2,000 divine kings to participate in the battle. More than 900 of them have died. Marshal Zhou also sent more than 10,000 soldiers. Now only about 8,000 of them are still alive. We can't go on like this. It's time to make a decision. The Master of Qingyu Hall's expression was gloomy as he spoke in a serious tone. Chapter 4467. The Master of Qingyu Hall was not afraid of Marshal Zhou, nor did he feel sorry for the 900 or so divine kings who had sacrificed their lives. After all, the Qingyu Hall had 200,000 citizens, and most of them were divine kings and divine emperors. As long as they cultivated peacefully for a few hundred years, a large number of divine kings would be born. The Master of Qingyu Hall only felt that the situation had escalated. In the beginning, he had expected the battle to reach this stage and the outcome would be decided. Even if the battle could not be decided, they could not continue. They had to find a way to stop it. If the situation continued to develop, it would definitely go out of control and turn into an all-out war. Therefore, the Master of Qingyu Hall gathered the guardians and elders. After much consideration, they finally decided to report the situation to the Kongming Temple. In a situation where neither side was willing to admit defeat, the Kongming Temple could only mediate and make a reasonable decision. However, doing so made it seem like they were going to tell their parents if they could not win. However, the Qingyu Hall was not a force that liked to fight. They did not want to see more of their citizens die in a war, so they had to do this. The two guardians and a few elders were not convinced. They angrily suggested that they should bring another 1,000 divine kings to end the battle once and for all. They wanted to kill or capture the thousands of soldiers involved in the battle to win the battle. Of course, they had to be fast and not give Marshal Zhou a chance to send reinforcements. However, the master of Qingyu Hall firmly rejected these suggestions. He said that this was not a good idea and that there was a great risk involved. The Mount of the Seven Moons was only 100,000 miles away from the Hanya fleet. If they sent another 1,000 divine kings as reinforcements, it would be difficult for the Hanya fleet to not notice. If that happened, Marshal Zhou would send another 10,000 soldiers to join the battle in a fit of anger. If that happened, the battle would never end. The two guardians and a few elders knew that the master of Qingyu Hall had made up his mind. They did not try to persuade him any further. They could only agree with the master of Qingyu Hall's decision. Therefore, the master of Qingyu Hall took out 3 special communication jade slips and prepared to report the situation to the 2nd Hall Master, 3rd Hall Master and 5th Hall Master. Even though he had already prepared a draft in his mind, he still had to explain the ins and outs of the whole matter clearly. Moreover, he had to consider the wording carefully and strictly. Therefore, when he reported the situation to the 3 palace masters, he had to treat it seriously. It would take at least 45 minutes. Ji Tianxing hid in the dark and listened to the conversation between the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors and the elders. When he saw the master of Qingyu Hall take out a communication jade slip to report the situation to the 3 hall masters, he quietly left the study. It was impossible for him to attack the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors and the elders. He could only create chaos in 7 Moons Mountain and make the situation completely out of control before the 3 hall masters received the news. Ji Tianxing first found a densely populated street in Floating City. He secretly slashed out a sword light that blotted out the sky and covered the area. The street was filled with tea houses and taverns. There were more than 1,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall gathered in the various tea houses and taverns, cursing the Hanya fleet with righteous indignation. The sudden appearance of the sword light caught everyone off guard. They did not have time to escape before they were drowned by the sword light. Rumble! A deafening boom rang out, reverberating in the sky and waking up the hundreds of thousands of people in the city. The huge impact destroyed the buildings and courtyards on the entire street, turning dozens of houses into ruins. Dust flew everywhere as cries and screams rang out, turning the entire street into a mess. The scene looked very chaotic, infuriating and shocking. But in reality, the number of casualties was not as high as imagined. Ji Tianxing's control over his power had reached the pinnacle. When the hundreds of sword lights slashed down, they only destroyed the entire street and created a huge commotion. In reality, only about 400 of the 1,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall were injured. The death toll was only about 30. This result could provoke the citizens of Qingyu Hall and make them angry and crazy. But it would not cause too many casualties and arouse the suspicions of the master of Qingyu Hall and the others. If he flattened the entire street with one move and killed hundreds of citizens of Qingyu Hall, as long as the master of Qingyu Hall was not stupid, he would definitely be suspicious. Just what kind of expert could have such terrifying power? The casualties in front of them matched the combat strength of a peak divine king. After flattening the entire street with one move, countless citizens screamed and rushed out of the ruins. They fled in all directions and screamed for help in panic. The patrolling guards around the city also chased after them. They surrounded the ruined street to search for the culprit and treat the injured. Of course, the news shocked the entire city and immediately spread to Qingyu Divine Palace. The master of Qingyu Hall was deliberating on how to report the situation to the Kongming Temple. Suddenly, he learned that a street in the city was destroyed and more than 1,000 citizens were attacked. He immediately put down his communication jade slip and rushed over with a few elders to check the situation. Reporting the situation to the temple masters of Kongming Temple was secondary. Checking the casualties of the citizens and finding the culprit immediately was the most important thing. Too arrogant, too arrogant. They don't take me seriously at all. When the master of Qingyu Hall rushed to the ruined street, his face was livid. Blue veins popped out in anger and his whole body was filled with a chilling aura. The elders were also filled with righteous indignation. They gnashed their teeth in hatred and their bodies were filled with a strong killing intent. Those bastards, they deserved to die. We have always abided by the bottom line, but they sent experts to sneak into our city and attack our citizens. They have no bottom line and are cruel and violent. Those bastards of the Prajna fleet, do they want to go to war and perish together? Everyone cursed angrily and rushed to the ruined street as fast as they could. When they saw the scene of devastation, the corpses scattered in the ruins and the hundreds of injured citizens, their anger became more and more difficult to control. 500 guards had already surrounded the ruins, and 300 guards were treating the injured. After the master of Qingyu Hall and the elders arrived, they immediately ordered the city to be locked down and the defense array to be activated. All the guards and deacons had to be mobilized. Even if they had to turn the entire city upside down, they had to find the culprit. The elders searched the ruined street but did not find any trace of the culprit. Therefore they advised the master of Qingyu Hall, "Hall master, the facts are in front of us. Do we still need to investigate? Even if the culprit has already gone into hiding and we can't catch him for the time being, there is no doubt about it. It must be Marshal Zhou who sent people to do it." "That's right. Other than those bastards of the Prajna fleet, who else has a grudge against us? Who would sneak into Floating City at this time and kill our citizens? Hallmaster, please give the order to allow us to gather 3,000 elites and charge into the Prajna fleet's camp. We will make them admit their crimes." Chapter 4468. An entire street was destroyed, hundreds of people were injured, and the entire city's 200,000 citizens were alarmed. This had completely infuriated the guardians and elders of Qingyu Hall, making them lose their rationality. No one wanted to bother about who was right or wrong, nor did they want to find out who made the first move or who caused the incident. They were aggrieved to the extreme and only wanted to lead the elite citizens to kill their way to the Hanya fleet and have a good massacre. But the few guardians and elders had lost their rationality, so the master of Qingyu Hall had to suppress his anger and maintain his calm. He gave the order sternly, allowing the few guardians and elders to calm down. The most important thing now was to save the injured and search for the culprit. If they didn't capture the culprit, the other party would still be hiding in the city, and that would be extremely dangerous. The two guardians and elders also understood this logic and knew the seriousness of the matter, so they could only suppress their anger and began to carry out their mission. A few of them led the guards to save the injured and to check the surroundings of the ruins. The other elders gathered more guards to patrol the entire city's defenses, and to search for the culprit's tracks. Logically speaking, the 200,000 citizens in the city were all from the Desolate race, so the culprit should be from the Hanya fleet and should be easy to identify. But the problem was, the 200,000 citizens in the city were in a state of chaos and anger. To find the culprit among the 200,000 people was simply too difficult. Moreover, everyone knew that for the culprit to be able to sneak into the city silently, and to cause such a huge number of casualties, his ability was definitely very strong. Even if he wasn't a peak god king, he must be a few 9th stage realm god kings working together. For this kind of strong practitioner, if he tried his best to hide, it was indeed very difficult to find him. If the culprit sneaked into a densely populated area and created the same disaster, then the entire city would be in chaos and lose control. Thinking of the seriousness of the consequences, the few guardians and elders hastened their pace of action. However, things still went according to the master of Qingyu Hall's expectations, and the situation escalated. Just as the few elders led the guards to search for the culprit's tracks in the city, near the city's defensive array, a troop of guards was attacked. There were 200 god kings in the troop and most of them were lower god kings. The deacon in the lead was at the 7th level of the god king realm. However, they didn't notice anything unusual. They were inspecting the defensive formation and carrying out the task assigned by the master of Qingyu Hall. The sword light that appeared out of nowhere drowned them on the spot, creating a deafening explosion. Boom! With an earth-shattering boom, dense cracks appeared on the defensive formation, and fragments of divine light splashed out in all directions. The houses and palaces in the vicinity of the Great Formation were all minced into pieces by the sword light that filled the sky, turning into a scene of desolation. Smoke and dust rose and the entire floating city began to shake. The already panicked and angry citizens of Qingyu Hall became even more chaotic. Such a huge commotion was frightening, but the casualties were not as serious as imagined. Out of the 200 Divine King guards, half of them were injured by the sword light. They were covered in blood and looked miserable. Only 20 or so guards were killed by the sword light and turned into ashes. Even so, this proved the master of Qingyu Hall's words. The culprit was indeed a peak god king and was still lurking in the city, attacking the citizens and guards of Qingyu Hall everywhere. If the culprit was not captured immediately, the entire city would fall into chaos and more people would die. As the deafening explosion dissipated, angry roars and curses, as well as shrill screams and painful cries, were heard one after another. After Ji Tianqing made his move, he quickly left and looked for the next target. He didn't stay in the vicinity at all. He didn't even need to see what happened to the crowd to know what the outcome would be. This was because the outcome was within his calculations. He had also suppressed his strength to release the sword light. A few deacons nearby rushed over with a few hundred guards. They wanted to save the injured guards and search for the culprit. The result could be imagined. The real culprit had brushed past them, but not a single person had noticed. When the few hundred guards rushed to the scene to save the injured guards and search the surrounding area, Ji Tianqing had already reached the next target. After 2 breaths, the master of Qingyu Hall and the 2 guardians came to their senses and rushed to the scene as fast as lightning. The 3 experts didn't have time to check on the injuries of the injured guards. They quickly released their divine senses to cover half of the city to search for the culprit. However, they found nothing. It was impossible for them to capture Ji Tianqing's trace and aura. The Hall Master of Pure Moon and the 2 protectors all felt a sense of defeat as well as shame and anger. The culprit attacked right under their noses, but they couldn't even detect the culprit's trace. This was too humiliating. Not only were the 2 guardians livid with anger, but their killing intent was also surging. Even the master of Qingyu Hall couldn't keep his composure. His patience was wearing out bit by bit and he gradually became furious and lost his mind. However, he couldn't find the culprit and couldn't vent his anger and killing intent. He could only muster his strength and release his divine senses to cover the entire city and monitor all the movements in the city. This time he was confident that as long as the culprit attacked again, he would be able to lock onto the culprit's aura and find him. Of course, in addition to using his divine senses to monitor the entire city, he also didn't forget to give orders to all the guards to be more alert. Moreover, all the deacons and elders under the command of Qingyu Hall had to lead the guards in person. The entire city quickly entered a state of alert. Many of the 100,000 Lian Air citizens stepped forward bravely and joined the ranks of the guards. Unfortunately, it was still useless. When Ji Tianqing attacked for the 3rd time and released a sky full of sword light to suddenly attack a group of guards, no one could react in time. The more than 300 guards were not the only ones who were stunned. They could only watch the sword light attack with their eyes wide open, unable to dodge. Even the master of Qingyu Hall was stunned. His heart was filled with shock and horror. He had been using his divine senses to monitor the entire city, but there were no signs. He also didn't see how the culprit attacked. Not only did he not detect the culprit's aura, but he also didn't know how many people there were. The facts proved that even though he was a peak divine king, there was still a huge gap between him and the culprit. How could the master of Qingyu Hall calm down? A loud rumbling sound was heard again. More than a dozen houses and palaces were destroyed. Cracks and holes appeared in the defensive array. 60% of the more than 300 guards were injured. More than 40 of them died on the spot. Compared to the previous 2 attacks, the casualties this time were even more tragic. This was undoubtedly adding fuel to the fire. After repeatedly provoking the master of Qingyu Hall's bottom line, he was finally enraged. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4469. Damn bastard. I will definitely kill you and tear you to shreds. After so many years, this was the first time the master of Qingyu Hall had roared out in front of so many people. All along, the Qingyu Hall's territory had been peaceful, and the master of Qingyu Hall had always been a kind person. But this time, the Hanya fleet's repeated provocations and endless invasions had made him lose his composure. However, none of the guardians, elders and guards felt that there was anything wrong with this. Their hearts were even more furious than the master of Qingyu Hall, their killing intent was even more turbulent, and their roars and curses were even louder. Kill the main culprit, we must burn his bones and scatter his ashes. This is too much, even if we have to flip the entire city upside down, we must find the culprit. We have been patient and patient, but the Hanya fleet still dares to invade without fear. We can't take it anymore. Hallmaster, please give the order. We will lead the elite citizens to attack the Hanya fleet. We must make them pay with their blood. A few elders asked to fight, and many of the guards also agreed, waving the blades in their hands. The Kenshin soldiers wanted to fight to the death with the Hanya fleet. Previously, the elders, attendants and protectors could not hold back their anger, and wanted to take revenge on the Hanya fleet, but the master of Qingyu Hall had been suppressing them. Now that the master of Qingyu Hall was furious and wanted to fight to the death with the Hanya fleet, everyone naturally volunteered to fight. The master of Qingyu Hall was a bit hesitant. What little rationality he had left told him that the most important thing to do now was to lock down the city and find the culprit. Sending a few thousand elite citizens to fight against the Hanya fleet was not a wise decision. After all, they were not fully prepared. But just as the master of Qingyu Hall was hesitating, on the other side of the city, sword lights filled the sky, and a deafening muffled sound rang out. Rumble. Over 1,000 streaks of dazzling sword light unleashed a terrifying might as they viciously slammed into the palaces and residences. There were more than 200 guards in that area as well as several hundred excited civilians. They were currently waving their weapons and shouting to attack the Hanya fleet. However, the sword light that suddenly filled the sky drowned out everything, causing everyone's roars to stop abruptly. Amidst the deafening noise, the palace and the courtyard were blasted into ruins and rubble flew everywhere. More than 200 guards and hundreds of civilians also suffered heavy casualties. More than 100 people were killed on the spot, and more than 300 people were either lightly or heavily injured. The scene was in a mess, and miserable shrill cries and howls of anguish resounded out without end. The master of Qingyu Hall, the guardians and the elders didn't even need to fly over. They could use their divine senses to investigate the situation in the ruins. When they saw the tragic scene in the ruins, their bodies trembled. Endless anger surged from the soles of their feet to the top of their heads. At this moment they could no longer suppress their anger. They completely erupted. The eyes of the two guardians and the elders all turned red. They roared without any regard for anything. They quickly gathered the Divine King's civilians and roared as they charged out of the city. Even though there were only 1,000 civilians that charged out of the city. However, immediately afterwards, over 3,000 Qingyu Hall civilians charged out of the city under the lead of the deacons without any regard for their own safety. They charged towards the Hanya fleet. Among the 3,000 civilians, only a portion of them were Divine King experts. Most of them were Upper Divine Lords. Even though Upper Divine Lords didn't have much of an advantage in a battle, they were still enraged. However, the people of the Pure Moon Hall were infuriated. They launched an attack without fear of death. They would rather die on the way than swallow their anger. If it was before, the master of Qingyu Hall would definitely try to stop the several thousand civilians from charging out and fighting against the Hanya fleet. However, right now he wanted nothing more than to personally lead his troops into battle. How could he stop them? All he could do was order the two protectors to gather the God King guards and help them out. He was worried that the 4,000 civilians wouldn't be able to break through the defenses of the Hanya fleet. They would also suffer heavy casualties. That was why he ordered the two guardians to hold the line. In addition, when the two sides fought head-on, they needed to arrange their troops. They also needed a commander to command them. They couldn't just charge and kill randomly. Otherwise, if their soldiers were separated, they would definitely be defeated by the Hanya fleet one by one. In the end, they would all be wiped out. It was a pity that the master of Qingyu Hall had to stay in the city and quickly find the culprit. He couldn't personally command the battle. He could only pray silently in his heart. He hoped that the several thousand civilians that had never participated in a battle before could cooperate with each other and display great battle strength. Even if they couldn't destroy the Hanya fleet, they had to heavily injure them and teach them a lesson. Afterwards, the two guardians gathered another 800 Divine King experts. They hurriedly left the city and rushed towards the Hanya fleet that was 100,000 li away. The two guardians controlled the overall situation. They commanded the 5,000 civilians of the Qingyu Hall to form a battle formation and attack the Hanya fleet. In the city, other than the 190,000 civilians, only the master of Qingyu Hall and 1,000 guards were left. They were still searching everywhere for the culprit. In order to prevent the casualties from increasing, the master of Qingyu Hall ordered all the civilians to calm down. They would gradually move towards the vicinity of the Qingyu Divine Palace from the north to the south. There was an unknown expert hiding in the city. It was no longer safe in the city. In comparison, it would be safer for all the civilians to move to the Qingyu Divine Palace and gather in the various palaces. The palaces were heavily guarded by soldiers and powerful defensive arrays were set up around them. The master of Qingyu Hall believed that even the peak divine king hiding in the dark wouldn't dare to attack the Qingyu Divine Palace. After all the civilians had evacuated, the city would become an empty city. The master of Qingyu Hall was confident that he could find the culprit. In the Hanya fleet, marshals were gathered a dozen heavenly generals to discuss countermeasures in the meeting hall. South of the fleet, within 1,000,000 miles, more than 20 battlefields were still fighting. Just now, a series of muffled sounds came from the Mount of the Seven Moons, and a dazzling divine light lit up. Marshall's divine sense couldn't detect the situation on the Mount of the Seven Moons, and the scouts he sent couldn't get close. No one knew what was happening on the Mount of the Seven Moons. However, Marshall's mind was very sharp. He immediately sensed that something big was about to happen. Not only did he gather all the heavenly generals for a meeting, but he also asked the guards to wake up Marshal Shi, who had been cultivating in seclusion. Marshal Zhou was starting to panic now that the situation had developed to this point. The situation was out of his control, and it was developing in an unpredictable direction. Marshal Zhou felt that he couldn't continue to act rashly. He also couldn't continue to replenish his forces to fight the Qingyu Hall. If this continued, they would sink deeper and deeper into the quagmire of war. In the end, they would have to fight the Qingyu Hall. He felt that it was time to report the situation to the Hanya God Emperor and ask the God Emperor to make a decision. Chapter 4470. Marshal Shi had been cultivating in seclusion, trying his best to break through to the God Emperor realm. After a month of seclusion, his strength had improved again and his combat ability had increased by a lot. Just as he was about to cultivate a few more divine Dao laws, a few guards came knocking on the door of the secret chamber. Marshal Shi was a little angry that his cultivation had been disturbed. After opening the door, he stared at the guards with a gloomy face and asked for the reason. The guards did not dare to hide anything. They quickly explained that Marshal Zhou had ordered them to knock on the door because the Prajna fleet and the Qingyu Hall had fallen out and were in the middle of a war. When Marshal Shi heard the news, he was stunned. He could not believe it. How could this be? Wasn't everything fine just now? Wasn't the Qingyu Hall very friendly and polite? We have the God Emperor, who is about to become the 6th Hallmaster of the temple. How could the Qingyu Hall dare to start a war with us? Marshal Shi's series of questions made the guards feel bitter. They did not know how to explain. Seeing the guards' expressions, Marshal Shi realized that the situation was serious. He did not waste any more time talking to them and hurried to the meeting hall. When he entered the meeting hall, there were already 24 heavenly generals gathered there. Marshal Zhou and the heavenly generals were discussing something. Their expressions were very serious and the atmosphere in the hall was very tense. Marshal Zhou, what's going on? How did we end up fighting with the Qingyu Hall? You have to give me a reasonable explanation. When the Prajna God Emperor went to the Kongming Temple, he had entrusted the entire fleet to the two of them. He had repeatedly warned them not to cause any trouble. Marshal Zhou had worked with Marshal Zhou for many years. He trusted Marshal Zhou very much, so he left everything to Marshal Zhou and went into seclusion to cultivate. He did not expect Marshal Zhou to cause such a big mess in just a month. Marshal Shi didn't need to think to know that Marshal Zhou must have let down his guard and made a mistake. When he thought about how angry the Prajna God Emperor would be when he heard the news, and how he would punish them, Marshal Shi couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. That was why he was so angry and questioned Marshal Zhou in public. Marshal Zhou was embarrassed by the question. He quickly waved his hand and said, "Marshal Shi, you've come at the right time. Please calm down and sit down and listen to my explanation." More than 20 divine generals also bowed and paid their respects to Marshal Shi. Marshal Shi had no choice but to suppress his anger. He sat down at the head of the table and listened to Marshal Zhou's explanation. Marshal Zhou kept it short and simple. He explained the cause of the incident and the current situation in a concise manner. Marshal Shi was even angrier when he heard that. He couldn't help but growl. Marshal Zhou. I trusted you so much, but I didn't expect you to be so muddle-headed. The culprit, Feiyang Shenwang, was an ignorant and incompetent person. He only got to where he was by sucking up to Qixia Deity King. Forget it. That bastard is probably dead. We can't punish him. Let's think about how to deal with the aftermath. Marshal Zhou nodded and said, That's right. We're discussing how to quell the flames of war. Marshal Shi glanced at the crowd and asked in a low voice, So what's the result of your discussion? Marshal Zhou revealed a bitter smile while the other godly generals shook their heads and remained silent. Marshal Shi slammed the table and said, If you can't come to a conclusion, then what are you waiting for? Immediately send a message to Her Majesty, report the truth to Her Majesty and ask her to make a decision. But Marshal Zhou hesitated. He lowered his voice and said, Marshal Shi, if the God Emperor hears about this, we'll be finished. Marshal Shi said righteously, The situation is already out of control. Are you still afraid of the God Emperor's punishment? We've already made one mistake after another. We can't be so stubborn. We'll wait until the situation is irreparable before we let the God Emperor know. Then we'll kill ourselves to atone for our sins. Marshal Shi said, but in his heart he was thinking, Zhou Qingshan, you old bastard, you've set me up. You're the one who made the mistake, but you want me to be punished with you? In your dreams. I'll explain everything to the God Emperor and cut all ties with him. If anyone is to be punished, it'll be you alone. Everyone was silent. They couldn't refute Marshal Shi's words. After hesitating for a while, Marshal Zhou finally made up his mind. He said, If that's the case, then we as marshals will jointly send a message to the God Emperor and tell him what happened. Marshal Shi sneered in his heart, but he had no choice but to agree. After all, he couldn't continue to hide the truth with Marshal Zhou. If he didn't report it, then he would be punished with Marshal Zhou. Marshal Zhou took out an exquisite purple jade scroll. He was thinking about how to explain it to the God Emperor without enraging the God Emperor. But before he could think of what to say, 2 dispatch guards rushed into the meeting hall in a hurry. Marshal Qingyu Hall has sent thousands of elite warriors. They're coming for us with murderous intent. Marshals, a team of 1,000 warriors from Qingyu Hall is approaching our fleet. They're attacking us without hesitation. The sudden news silenced everyone in the meeting hall for a moment. When they came back to their senses, their expressions changed drastically. They cursed angrily and started to discuss among themselves. The Pure Moon Hall actually sent thousands of swordsmen to attack our fleet? Are the people of Qingyu Hall crazy? Or is the master of Qingyu Hall crazy? Even if we have grudges and conflicts, we've always sent troops in batches and fought small-scale battles. Everyone can stay rational and try not to escalate the situation. What's Qingyu Hall trying to do? Is this a declaration of war? Those barbarians from Qingyu Hall don't know what's good for them. How dare they attack our fleet? We'll make sure they don't return. The heavenly generals were shocked and angry, but they weren't worried about the safety of the fleet and the soldiers. After all, they had more than 80,000 soldiers and more than 400 heavenly warships. And Qingyu Hall had only sent a few thousand people to attack them. If they really fought, the Prajna fleet would definitely not lose. But the 2 marshals' thoughts weren't that simple. Marshal Zhou frowned and thought for a while. Then he suddenly realized something. With the master of Qingyu Hall's personality, he wouldn't be so reckless as to send troops to attack us directly. It must be because of the commotion in Mount Seven Moons. Someone must have fought in the city and angered the master of Qingyu Hall. That's why he made this decision. Marshal Shi was full of doubts. He frowned and asked, Someone fought in the city of Mount Seven Moons? Marshal Zhou, did you send assassins to assassinate the elders of Qingyu Hall? Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Chapter 4471. When he heard that there was a fight on Mount Seven Moons, Marshal Shi's first thought was that Marshal Zhou had sent assassins. However, Marshal Zhou was also puzzled. He asked, How is that possible? No matter how angry I am, I would never give such an irrational order. Besides, the Qingyu Hall is guarding the city tightly. Even if I sent assassins, it would be difficult for them to sneak into the city. Marshal Shi thought about it and agreed. Other than immortal kings like himself and Marshal Zhou, it was impossible for anyone else to sneak into the city. That's strange. If it wasn't an assassin sent by us, who else would assassinate the people of Qingyu Hall? Marshal Shi was filled with questions and couldn't figure it out. A few immortal generals guessed, maybe it was another enemy of Qingyu Hall? The Kongming Temple has dozens of halls under its command. It's normal for there to be conflicts between the various halls, right? It doesn't make much sense for us to worry about who fought on Mount Seven Moons now. No matter who the assassin is, Qingyu Hall has already pinned the blame on us. They have already sent their troops to attack us. Our top priority now is to defend ourselves and fight back. Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi understood that they had to prioritize. It was no longer important who the assassin was that sneaked into Mount Seven Moons. In the face of a great enemy, their top priority was to defend against Qingyu Hall's attack and protect their own fleet and soldiers. Marshal Zhou decisively gave the order. He named 18 immortal generals and asked them to lead the fleet and soldiers into battle formations to face the enemy. Afterwards, Admiral Shi also gave the order for all the soldiers in the fleet to immediately enter a state of combat readiness. After the entire fleet was ready, the two marshals only needed to give the order for the fleet to fight back with all their might or escape at full speed. Although the two marshals would not admit that they were escaping, they would only call it a strategic retreat. However, this preparation was necessary. The two marshals did not dare to be arrogant and think that they could take on the entire Qingyu Hall head-on. This was the base of Qingyu Hall, and it was only 100,000 li away from Seven Moon Mountain. Qingyu Hall had 200,000 citizens, and more than half of them had reached the God Monarch realm. There were also countless God King realm experts. If the two sides fought too fiercely and went all out, Qingyu Hall would definitely come out in full force. At that time, what would the Hanya fleet use to defend? A strategic retreat was a must. After the two marshals gave their orders, all the divine generals went to carry them out. Very quickly, the entire Hanya fleet moved, and a dozen warships adjusted their positions, forming a defensive formation outside. Every divine warship lit up with dazzling divine light, forming a huge barrier of divine light. At the same time, all the divine warships activated their divine cannons. Hundreds of cannons accumulated terrifying power and were aimed at the northern sky. 1,000 miles to the north of the fleet, the 1,000 elites of Qingyu Hall formed a battle formation and joined forces to launch an attack. They rushed over aggressively as if they had lost their minds. There was indeed a group of guards who used their full strength without hesitation, using all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate skills to attack the Hanya fleet. However, they attacked in a disorderly manner and could not harm the Hanya fleet at all. Therefore, those guards could only calm down, and the 1,000 experts formed a battle formation under the command of their leader, and joined forces to attack. In this way, everyone joined forces to unleash even more powerful combat power, and release divine arts that blotted out the sky and earth, finally posing a threat to the Hanya fleet. Bang! 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 Boom! Boom! The sky was filled with the radiance of divine arts, and it carried terrifying power as it fiercely bombarded the numerous warships. Those warships were trembling from the attacks and they flashed with divine light. However, the fleet had a fixed formation and they had to maintain the formation to unleash more power. Even if those warships were attacked, they did not dare to change their positions and they dodged randomly. When the 1,000 elites of Qingyu Hall saw that their attacks were effective, and that they had greatly weakened the defenses of those divine warships, they attacked even more desperately. At this time, the 18 divine generals commanded the 30 divine warships to adjust their positions, forming a barrier of divine light outside, and only then did they block the attacks of the Qingyu Hall's elites. The situation of the battle immediately stabilized and both sides maintained a balance. The 1,000 elites of Qingyu Hall who had led the charge had no choice but to calm down and wait for more elite citizens to come to their aid. The Hanya fleet was not in a hurry to counterattack, and they were adjusting their formation in an orderly manner. More than 400 divine warships were ready for battle. For the time being, both sides did not communicate verbally, but they were accumulating their power in tacit understanding, and they attacked and defended back and forth. After 10 breaths, another 3,000 or so citizens of Qingyu Hall rushed to the battlefield as fast as lightning. The 4,000 or so citizens of Qingyu Hall quickly gathered together, and formed an even more powerful attack formation. The two protectors personally held the formation, and they commanded the thousands of citizens to fight together. Many attendants also did their best to help, and they corrected some mistakes in time to ensure that the formation was more perfect. In addition, the two protectors also ordered 800 Divine King experts to gather, and they were on their way here. The citizens of Qinyu Hall had never experienced such a large-scale battle before, and they were a bit flustered at the beginning and they frequently made mistakes. However, with the two protectors holding the fort and the many attendants coordinating, they finally eliminated many of the mistakes, and they successfully formed a huge battle formation in the end. Under the command of the two protectors, more than 4,800 soldiers cast divine arts in batches, and they unleashed violent divine power, attacking the Hanya fleet with all their might. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Tens of thousands of divine arts, shining with dazzling divine light, rained down on the Hanya fleet. The sky-blotting divine light barrier of the Hanya fleet fiercely bombarded the divine light barrier, and an earth-shattering boom erupted and countless divine light shards splashed everywhere. The terrifying shockwaves turned into 5-colored hurricanes that spread out in all directions, and swept across a radius of tens of thousands of miles. The battle became more and more intense. While the Hanya fleet was resisting the attacks, they also began to counterattack. All of the soldiers stayed within the divine warships and they did not need to attack at all. The 400 or so divine warships were also divided into several batches, and they took turns bombarding the thousands of elites of Qinyu Hall. Each divine warship could release more than 300 beams of light at the same time, and each batch had 100 divine warships firing, and they shot out more than 30,000 beams of light. The power of such a large-scale bombardment was extremely terrifying. The two protectors and a few elders of Qinyu Hall could only command the 800 Divine King experts that had just arrived on the battlefield, and they worked together to cast divine arts to resist. Just like that, the two sides fought back and forth and it was difficult to tell who had the upper hand. After 100 breaths of time, the Hanya fleet showed signs of damage, and the defensive light barriers of a few divine warships were shattered, and holes and cracks appeared on the bodies of the divine warships. The 5,600 elites of Qinyu Hall also showed signs of casualties. More than 100 divine monarchs were killed and their bodies were shattered and their bones turned to dust. There were also a few unlucky divine kings who were hit by the beams of light, and their bodies were covered in wounds and they were dripping with blood. Obviously, it was very difficult for the 5,000 elites of Qinyu Hall to shake the colossus that was the Hanya fleet. Chapter 4472. Qinyu Hall had already mobilized 60% of its elite experts. Of the 5,000 people participating in the battle, half of them were godly king experts. Seven Moon Mountain and Qinyu Divine Palace still had 190,000 people, but there were only 1,000 godly kings. Most of them were godly monarchs. Logically speaking, these 5,000 people participating in the battle were enough to attack Hanya fleet. But both sides were easy to defend and hard to attack. Whoever initiated the attack would be at a disadvantage. Hanya fleet's 400 godly warships formed a huge battle formation. Their defensive power was very strong and was not any weaker than the city on Seven Moon Mountain. As long as all the godly warships activated their godly cannons and unleashed a torrential bombardment, it would be enough to suppress the 5,000 people in Qinyu Hall. The 90,000 soldiers did not need to be mobilized, but the godly warships consumed a lot of resources. Fortunately, Hanya fleet had an abundant supply of cultivation resources. Even if they continued to fight for decades, they would not run out. Thus, the 5,000 elites in Qinyu Hall were once again at a disadvantage. Everyone was even more furious and aggrieved. The battle was still going on. The 5,000 people in Qinyu Hall worked even harder. They attacked together without caring about anything else. The two protectors and a few elders were anxious. They could only observe Hanya fleet carefully, trying to find a weak point and a breakthrough. But unfortunately, Hanya fleet's battle formation was perfect. It was researched and created by Hanya God Emperor. There were almost no loopholes. The two protectors and a few elders felt despair. They calculated that even if they fought for another 10 days or half a month, they might not be able to break through Hanya fleet. And in the battle, Hanya fleet's warships would only be damaged, but their own side would have to pay with lives. The damaged warships would quickly retreat to the center of the battle formation and repair in a safe place. Immediately, there would be intact warships that would replace the damaged warships and maintain the order of the battle formation. They are indeed a bunch of bastards who are good at fighting. Invaders. After 15 minutes of fighting, the two protectors came to this conclusion for Hanya fleet. The other side's rich battle experience and quick response made the people in Qingyu Hall gasp in amazement, but they were also helpless. In this 15 minutes, Hanya fleet didn't suffer any substantial damage, but more than 400 divine monarchs and 20 divine kings from Qingyu Hall were killed. Left with no other choice, the two guardians could only order a temporary halt to the attack and order the 5,000 people to retreat 10,000 miles. When everyone had retreated thousands of miles away, the two guardians hurriedly sent a message to the master of Qingyu Hall, reporting the situation of the battle and asking for reinforcements and orders. The Hanya fleet was also very cooperative. Seeing that the Qingyu Hall had stopped attacking, they did not pursue and kill. While the 5,000 elites of the Qingyu Hall were resting, the Hanya squadron was also making adjustments in secret, preparing for the upcoming battle. In the city of Mount Seven Moons, the master of Qingyu Hall was leading many divine king experts to hunt down the assassins in the city. They didn't miss a single inch of the city. The 190,000 people were still moving to Clear Moon Divine Palace and other palaces. Currently, more than half of them had been moved and there were still more than 40,000 people in the city. The master of Qingyu Hall was a little worried. If the assassins attacked while the people were moving, the consequences would be too serious. Therefore, he assigned 500 divine king experts to guard the exit of the city to Clear Moon Divine Palace to ensure the safety of the people. Up until now, the master of Qingyu Hall had been searching for 15 minutes and had turned the entire city upside down several times. But unfortunately, he still couldn't find any traces of the assassins. The master of Qingyu Hall was getting more and more anxious, and his anger and murderous intent were getting stronger and stronger. As he cursed the assassins, he gritted his teeth and swore that he would make the bastards of Hanya fleet pay the heaviest price. At this moment, he suddenly received a message from the two guardians. After reading the message, the master of Qingyu Hall's face became even more embarrassed, and his eyes were burning with hatred and murderous intent. Damn it! The master of Qingyu Hall clenched his fists tightly and crushed the message jade slip into pieces. He turned his head to look in the direction of Clear Moon Divine Palace, and then looked at the sky in the south. He really wanted to immediately bring people to support the two guardians and attack the Hanya fleet with all his might. But he couldn't let go of the hundreds of thousands of people, so he couldn't just leave now. By now, he had already understood the Hanya fleet's scheme. On one hand, they sent assassins into Seven Moon Mountain to kill the people of my hall and create chaos and panic. On the other hand, they fought with the elite people of my hall, causing me to be unable to take care of both sides. The bastards under the command of the Hanya God Emperor are not only good at war, but they are also good at scheming. They are too despicable. For a moment, the master of Qingyu Hall felt helpless and aggrieved. But he was still able to keep his mind clear, and he immediately made a decision to send a message to the two guardians. I am moving the people in the city. There are still more than 40,000 people who need my supervision and protection. Rest for a while. After I have settled all the people, I will lead the soldiers to support you. The master of Qingyu Hall was very decisive and chose to give up on searching for the assassins. This was because he knew that the assassins had been hiding their strength and deliberately creating chaos to pin him down in Seven Moon Mountain. As long as he settled all the people, he wouldn't have to care about the assassins anymore and would directly attack the Hanya fleet. While the master of Qingyu Hall was searching the city and the hundreds of thousands of people were moving to Clear Moon Divine Palace, Xianxia had already left the city in the midst of the chaos. He was in the sky outside the city, observing the situation from a high vantage point. No matter if it was the city, Clear Moon Divine Palace, or the battlefield 100,000 miles to the south, he knew everything like the back of his hand. If he was the leader of the Hanya fleet, he would definitely try to sneak into Clear Moon Divine Palace and kill the people of Qingyu Hall to create more chaos and hatred. Once something happened to Clear Moon Divine Palace, the master of Qingyu Hall would not be able to take care of both the front and the back, and would definitely suffer a crushing defeat. But Xianxia saw the battle between the Hanya fleet and the 5,000 people of the desolate race, and he knew that the Qingyu Hall was on the verge of going crazy. So he decided not to attack the people of Qingyu Hall and disappear. Only in this way could the master of Qingyu Hall quickly settle all the people under his command, and then gather the most powerful forces to attack the Hanya fleet. His plan would only be completed when both sides fought with all their might, regardless of the consequences and the cost. He could already imagine the expression of the Hanya God Emperor, who was far away in the Kongming Temple when he heard this shocking news. The master of Qingyu Hall and the many people of Clear Moon Divine Palace spent a quarter of an hour full of vigilance and fear. Strangely, nothing happened in this quarter of an hour. It was very peaceful. More than 40,000 people of Qingyu Hall had successfully entered Clear Moon Divine Palace. The city was completely empty and the assassins did not attack again. It was as if they had already left Seven Moon Mountain. The master of Qingyu Hall heaved a sigh of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He ordered Clear Moon Divine Palace and the surrounding palaces to activate all the defensive arrays and enter a sealed state. Only then did he gather 10,000 elite citizens and charge towards Hanya's fleet in a grandiose manner. Chapter 4473. 1 or 2,000 people charging and 10,000 experts moving at the same time were two completely different concepts. The divine light that covered the sky and emitted a divine might that could suppress the heaven and earth rushed towards the south in a grandiose manner, like the scorching sun in the sky. Even though there were only 1,000 or so divine king experts among the 10,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall, the rest were all high divine lords. But they were aggressive, their killing intent filled the sky, as if they could engulf the heaven and earth, annihilating everything. Not long later, the master of Qingyu Hall led the 10,000 soldiers to the battlefield. The 5,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall who were resting and reorganizing, seeing the hall master personally come, were all excited, filled with anticipation. Everyone's morale rose again, and they were even more confident in breaking through the defense of the Great Wisdom Fleet. The master of Qingyu Hall and the two elders walked straight to the front of the battle formation. The remaining dozen or so attendants arranged the 10,000 citizens to form a battle formation with the 5,000 people, preparing to fight together. When the master of Qingyu Hall came to the front of the battle formation, the left and right protectors and several elders hurriedly came to greet him, saluting and reporting the situation of the battle. After hearing the report of the two protectors, the master of Qingyu Hall stared at the Great Wisdom Fleet 10,000 li away, frowning and saying, "This group of hateful fellows, they are actually relying on the defense of the fleet and not sending people to fight. They are really too cunning." Looking at the formation of the 400 warships, it is focused on defense. It will definitely be very difficult to break through. Even the master of Qingyu Hall felt that it was very troublesome. The eyes of the two protectors and several elders dimmed, and they were somewhat anxious and worried. "Hallmaster, could it be that the defense of the Great Wisdom Fleet is really so strong that we are unable to break through? If we are unable to break through with a frontal attack, then we can only think of other methods." The two protectors and several elders began to ponder. If they did not attack directly, how could they break through the defense of the Great Wisdom Fleet? But after pondering for a while, they felt that it was not very possible. More than 400 battleships lined up in the sky, as sturdy as a city, looking impenetrable. At this moment, the master of Qingyu Hall said, "Everyone, don't think about it anymore. There's no better way than to attack head-on and concentrate on one point. We only need to think of a way to erupt with our strongest power, and we will be able to tear a hole in the defense of the Hanya fleet. If the fleet doesn't move, it will be difficult for us to break through their defenses. As long as the fleet is forced to move, they will reveal some flaws." After hearing what the master of Qingyu Hall said, everyone nodded in agreement. That's right, they only had 15,000 people on their side. Although they were all elites, their numbers were simply too small. Once they spread out to surround and attack Hanya's fleet, it would be very difficult to achieve any results, and it would be easy for them to be defeated one by one. Just as the master of Qingyu Hall had said, only if everyone focused their attacks on one point could they hope to break through the defense of the Hanya fleet. The two protectors and several elders began to rack their brains, thinking about how to concentrate their strength. "Hallmaster, how about we command all the people to form the Celestial Stars Formation, with you as the eye of the formation? The Celestial Stars Formation is indeed suitable for large-scale battles, and it can gather the strength of more than 10,000 people. But the power of the attack is not enough. Compared to the Celestial Stars Formation, I feel that the 9 Dragons Universe Formation passed down by the temple is more suitable. Forming a battle formation is only one of the methods. Everyone, don't forget that we still have a very powerful trump card. I remember now. It's the divine weapon that the temple bestowed 20,000 years ago, the primordial scroll that can suppress the fate of millions of miles of territory." That's right. How could we forget about the primordial scroll? Ever since the temple bestowed that divine weapon to our hall 20,000 years ago, It has been stored in Qingyu Divine Palace to suppress the fate of our Hall territory. Over the past 20,000 years, our Hall territory has always been peaceful and smooth. Although the primordial scroll bestowed by the temple is very precious and can't be used easily, it's time to show the power of the divine weapon at such a critical moment. Don't forget that besides the primordial scroll, we still have a few very powerful weapons, all of which are top-grade king-level divine weapons that have almost never been used. That's great. The Crescent Moon Saber, the Vast Sky Sword, and the Sky-Rumbling Cauldron can finally be used. The primordial scroll that the two protectors and several elders were talking about was a treasure bestowed by the Kongming Temple to suppress fate and protect the territory of Qingyu Hall. Qingyu Hall would never use that divine weapon unless it was a matter of life and death. Although the primordial scroll was only a top-grade king-level divine weapon, it was infinitely close to an emperor-level divine weapon, and its power was unfathomable. As for the other three divine weapons, they were also top-grade king-level divine weapons, both of which were far superior to the natal divine weapon used by the master of Qingyu Hall, both in terms of finesse and power. For the past 20,000 years, the territory of Qingyu Hall had been very peaceful, so the three divine weapons had been kept in Qingyu Divine Palace without any use. Now that Qingyu Hall was in great trouble, the protectors and elders finally remembered the treasures they had. The master of Qingyu Hall frowned and thought for a while, then made up his mind and agreed to the request. Good. Everyone wait here and command all the people to form the Nine Dragons Universe formation. You must have the strongest combat power. I'll go back to Qingyu Divine Palace now and take back the primordial scroll and the three divine weapons. After giving the order, the master of Qingyu Hall turned and flew back to Seven Moon Mountain. The two protectors, elders and deacons didn't stay idle either. They quickly carried out the master of Qingyu Hall's order and arranged the 15,000 soldiers to form the formation. Logically speaking, this was the time when the people of Qingyu Hall were at their weakest. If the soldiers of the Prajna fleet launched a general attack at this time, even if they couldn't wipe out the 15,000 people, they could at least severely injure them. But it was a pity that the Prajna fleet missed this perfect opportunity. Marshal Zhou had already made a big mistake which made Marshal Shi very unhappy, so he didn't dare to act rashly and act arbitrarily. If he ordered the soldiers to take the initiative to attack, he had to get Marshal Shi's permission. Marshal Shi had just finished his secluded meditation and didn't know the specific situation, so he naturally wouldn't give the order rashly. Everything was based on stability, not making any mistakes, persisting in defense and looking for a chance to counterattack. This was Marshal Shi's way of the middle road. But the two marshals didn't know what the master of Qingyu Hall was doing or what they were going to face next. Otherwise, they would definitely regret their steadiness and hesitation at this time. But this was the way of war. Opportunities were often fleeting and there was no room for hesitation. Seeing that the people of Qingyu Hall had stopped attacking and were forming the formation, all the soldiers of the Prajna fleet could only be more vigilant and alert. Everyone was ready to go, waiting for the two marshals' orders at any time. 15 minutes later, the master of Qingyu Hall returned and successfully took out the primordial scroll and the three divine weapons. The real decisive battle was about to begin. Chapter 4474. The master of Qingyu Hall's natal divine artifact was a supreme-grade king divine artifact. The two protectors' natal divine artifacts were the same, but they were slightly weaker. Therefore, the master of Qingyu Hall had to personally wield the primordial scroll and use it as the core of the 15,000 people. As for the other three great weapons, he gave the tidal moon saber and the vast sky sword to the left and right protectors. As for the heaven rumbling cauldron, he gave it to the grand elder, who was highly respected and powerful. After everyone received the divine artifacts, they didn't dare to waste any time. They hurriedly refined them and merged their minds with the divine artifacts. Only then could they unleash more power. The hall master of the Pure Moon Hall held a simple and unadorned black jade box with both hands, and opened it solemnly with a solemn expression. Boxes made of divine jade were very common, but black jade was very rare. This black jade box was especially rare. The Qingyu Hall had found it in an excellent mine more than 20,000 years ago. The basin-sized black jade was the core and source of the entire mine. It was the quintessential divine artifact. After the Qingyu Hall obtained the black jade, they had been hesitant about what kind of divine artifact to make it into. It wasn't until the Kongming Temple gave the primordial scroll that the master of Qinyu Hall finally made the decision to make the black jade into a box to contain the primordial scroll. This was the first time the master of Qinyu Hall had opened the primordial scroll in the past 20,000 years. With a soft click, the black jade box opened to reveal a 2-foot-wide dark golden scroll. The scroll was made of a special divine metal. It could be as hard as an emperor-grade divine artifact or as soft as water. The surface of the scroll was engraved with dense dark patterns. It was very mysterious and seemed to contain the principles of heaven and earth. The dark patterns on the surface were like flowing light. They were crystal clear and flowed. The entire scroll was enveloped in a bright divine light, exuding a terrifying aura that caused one's heart to palpitate. The master of Qinyu Hall held the scroll with both hands and released his divine power with a solemn expression, refining the scroll with his mind. He could clearly feel that the scroll had already merged with the world, as if it had a life of its own. It was breathing lightly and moving rhythmically. At the same time, the 15,000 elite citizens of Qinyu Hall finished setting up the array and started to cast spells together to connect their godly powers. Shua. Every Sir God and Godly King expert lit up with a layer of divine light that extended to their companions. Thus, tens of thousands of rays of light quickly spread out and connected with each other, condensing into a large net with a radius of 3,000 miles. The 15,000 or so citizens were divided into 9 teams. After forming a divine light net, they were like 9 mighty and domineering divine dragons that were tightly linked together. As the formation was activated, everyone released their divine senses. The 9 divine dragons also bared their fangs and brandished their claws. They lit up with divine light and released endless killing intent. Another 100 breaths of time passed. The 15,000 citizens were ready to attack at any time. At this time, the left and right protectors and the Grand Elder had already refined the 3 lethal weapons. They could use them smoothly and use 80% of their power. The master of Qinyu Hall also refined the scroll quickly and could use it normally, displaying 70% of its power. The time was right. The master of Qinyu Hall didn't waste any more time and immediately gave the order to attack. Kill. Avenge our dead brothers and sisters. The Hall Master of the Pure Moon Hall raised her arms and shouted loudly, giving the order in a booming voice. The 15,000 citizens who had been ready for a long time also let out a shout and released their divine power with all their might, launching an attack. The 9 divine dragons, lit up with divine light and released divine fire and lightning that covered the sky. They gathered into 9 enormous light pillars and attacked the Prajna fleet in front of them at the same time. The 9 light pillars were 1,000 miles long and they were like 9 divine dragons, moving forward side by side. Such a ferocious attack made the hearts of the officers and soldiers of the Great Wisdom Fleet jump up. Under the command of Marshal Zhou, more than 30 divine warships released their strongest power and condensed an even thicker divine light barrier. The other 400 divine warships fired their divine cannons in unison, firing the most violent divine power light beams to meet the 9 divine dragons. The 9 divine dragons were about to hit the divine light barrier of the Prajna fleet. Marshal Zhou and countless soldiers were a little worried. Could the barrier withstand the attack of the 9 divine dragons? But at this time something unexpected happened. The 9 divine dragons that were roaring and baring their fangs and claws merged into one in an instant. The 9 divine dragons merged into one. Its size didn't increase by much, but it was so condensed that it looked like a real dragon. Of course, this super strengthened version of the divine dragon's power was also increased by nearly 9 times. Seeing this, Marshal Zhou's expression changed. He knew this was bad. He knew very well what it meant when the 9 divine dragons merged into one and their power increased by 9 times. So his heart was in his mouth. Boom. In the next moment, the super strengthened version of the divine dragon hit the divine light barrier with a loud bang. In the loud bang, a huge hole was blasted in the divine light barrier. Countless cracks extended around it and tens of thousands of divine light shards splashed out. There was no suspense. The divine light barrier formed by more than 30 divine warships was destroyed by the super dragon in one fell swoop. The 30 divine warships were all shaken by the recoil. They were all shaking and flashing with divine light. Then the super dragon hit the light pillars that filled the sky. The tens of thousands of light pillars were very powerful, but their spread-out area was too large and their power was not enough. So, the super dragon smashed another few hundred divine light pillars and violently blasted a hole in the barrier. Finally, it hit a divine warship. Bang! Another earth-shattering explosion erupted, reverberating endlessly between heaven and earth. The super dragon exploded on the spot, turning into billions of divine light shards that scattered in all directions. But the unlucky divine warship was also blown in half. It broke at the waist and countless shards and debris flew everywhere. The 200 or so soldiers in the divine warship were also very unlucky. 70% of them were killed on the spot. The remaining 30% of the soldiers were lucky enough to survive, but they were also covered in wounds. It was a tragic sight and they had almost lost their ability to fight. In addition, the explosion of the divine warship and the super dragon damaged 2 divine warships nearby, greatly weakening their defense. Fortunately, the Prajna fleet had enough divine warships. Losing only 1 warship was not a big deal and it did not affect the defense array. But this was only the beginning of the final battle. At this moment, the master of Qingyu Hall formed a spell with both hands and released the divine power that he had been accumulating for a long time. His body emitted a divine light that shot up to the sky. The long scroll that was floating in front of him was finally opened by him. The simple and mysterious scroll slowly unfurled, revealing a very simple picture that contained the aura of the primordial age in heaven and earth. Buzz. Heaven and earth within 100,000 miles immediately shook. Chapter 4475. The long scroll of the ancients had already fused with Qingyu Hall's territory, and its aura was connected. When the scroll opened, the heaven and earth within a radius of 100,000 miles also trembled, releasing all of its power and gathering it between heaven and earth. As the master of Qingyu Hall continued to cast the spell, his expression became more and more serious, and the long scroll of the ancients opened more and more images. Naturally, the range of heaven and earth controlled by the long scroll of the ancients also became wider and wider. From 100,000 miles to 200,000 miles, to 300,000 miles. Finally, the master of Qingyu Hall unleashed his strongest power, and used all of his strength to control the long scroll of the ancients, causing it to unfold to about 80%. At this moment, the range of heaven and earth controlled by the long scroll of the ancients had reached a terrifying 1,000,000 miles. Formless divine power surged between heaven and earth, and under the control of the master of Qingyu Hall, it fiercely pressed down on the Hanya fleet. Suddenly, the endless power of heaven and earth seemed to condense into a pair of giant palms that blotted out the sky, and slammed down on the Hanya fleet. The 90,000 soldiers of the Hanya fleet all felt an inexplicable fear and panic, as if their throats were being strangled. They were filled with fear and their faces were filled with worry and fear, but they couldn't make a sound and they couldn't shout. Only the divine king generals could use their divine power to control the divine ships, and use all of their strength to form a shield. But all of this was futile. Boom! In the next moment, the formless giant palms of heaven and earth slammed down on the Hanya fleet. The giant barrier of divine light was instantly smashed into pieces, and millions of shards of divine light burst out. With a series of cracking sounds, the defense of the Hanya fleet was destroyed. The 30-odd divine ships that were responsible for forming the barrier were also greatly shaken, and they suffered different degrees of damage. Marshal Zhou and the divine generals hurriedly ordered all of the soldiers to quickly repair the damaged divine ships and form a defensive formation again. However, Qingyu Hall didn't give them the time or opportunity to repair it all, and the 9 Dragons Universe formation formed by 15,000 people launched a fierce attack again. Roar! With a world-shaking dragon roar, the 15,000 people released a 5-colored divine dragon that was 1,000 miles long, and it once again attacked the Hanya fleet. This time the officers and soldiers of the Prajna fleet learned their lesson. With the lesson just now, they knew that the 9 divine dragons would definitely merge into one and focus their attacks on a certain point of the Hanya fleet. After all, Hanya's fleet was too big of a target. With 9 divine dragons attacking together, their power was too scattered. Therefore, even without Marshal Zhu's command or order, all the soldiers were ready. They gathered the power of all the divine warships and joined forces to face the enemy's attack. However, to everyone's surprise, Qingyu Hall, which was not good at war, actually played a trick. Just as the 9 divine dragons flew to the front of the fleet and were about to merge into one, they changed directions and continued to attack the Hanya fleet. It was still the same 9 divine dragons. They had not merged, but their arrangement had changed and the area they covered had shrunk by half. Such a change caught the officers and soldiers of the Sanskrit fleet somewhat unprepared. Even if they wanted to adjust the distribution of their defensive forces, it was already too late. Boom. Rumble. With an earth-shaking explosion, the 9 divine dragons fiercely bombarded the Hanya fleet, bursting out divine light that covered the sky. The officers and soldiers of the Hanya fleet had underestimated the power of the 9 divine dragons. Not only did the defensive light barrier that they had formed with all their strength have a huge hole in it, but it also shattered into pieces. The other 6 divine dragons struck more than a dozen divine warships, bursting out with destructive power. 6 divine warships were broken at the waist and thousands of soldiers died on the spot, turning into ashes. The other 6 divine warships were also heavily damaged and could not be repaired in a short time, so they could not display much of their power. The Hanya fleet was heavily damaged one after another, and the officers and soldiers were somewhat flustered and angry. Marshals Wu quickly ordered the many divine generals to adjust the fleet. As for the 15,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall, their morale was greatly boosted and they were all in high spirits. From their point of view, the defense of the Hanya fleet had been broken, and it could no longer stop them. Therefore many elders and deacons rubbed their fists and rubbed their palms, eager to lead their people to charge into Hanya's fleet and slaughter them in all directions. However, the master of Qingyu Hall did not let the temporary victory go to his head, and he still maintained his calm. Seeing that everyone was excited, he quickly advised, "Everyone, don't get too excited. We only destroyed the defensive barrier of the Hanya fleet, and did not cause them too much damage. We need to work together to form a battle formation, and rely on the power of the 4 divine items to suppress the Hanya fleet. If we rashly disperse and attack, we will definitely fall into a passive position." Hearing the reminder of the master of Qingyu Hall, the elders and deacons calmed down, and they continued to rely on the battle formation to continue their attacks. The 9 Dragons Universe formation could not only gather everyone's power, but it could also be used to attack and defend. The 15,000 citizens fought steadily, and they were not in a hurry to advance. They only worked together to cast spells, and destroyed the enemy's divine warships one after another. The master of Qingyu Hall, the left and right protectors, and the great elder controlled the 4 divine items, and continuously released powerful divine abilities and secret techniques to suppress and weaken the power of the Hanya fleet. In the blink of an eye, an hour had passed. The situation of the battle had been completely reversed, and the Hanya fleet had been beaten to a miserable state, unable to fight back at all. More than 40 divine warships had been destroyed, and more than 20 divine warships had been heavily damaged. On the other hand, the citizens of Qingyu Hall became more and more confident as they fought, and their morale soared as if they did not know the concept of fatigue. Under such circumstances, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi had no choice but to discuss countermeasures with the other divine generals. The battle was urgent, and they could not gather in the meeting hall to discuss, and could only discuss through telepathy. "We can't go on like this. Our casualties will continue to increase, and our power will be worn down bit by bit. It seems that the Kongming Temple has indeed imparted many ultimate techniques to the Qingyu Hall. That great formation is almost flawless and it will be very difficult to break through. There's also the divine items that the master of Qingyu Hall controls. The aura of those divine items is even stronger than that of a supreme-grade king-level divine item. Their destructive power is too great. Especially the scroll that the master of Qingyu Hall controls. It's the core treasure of the Qingyu Hall, and its power is the most terrifying. That scroll can gather the power of the heavens and the earth, and it possesses inexhaustible power. We've observed for so long and we really can't think of a good way to break that scroll. I feel that we can't continue to stay here and passively take a beating. Either we move to another location or we send out our soldiers to fight. It's too strenuous to rely on the divine warships to deal with the people of Qingyu Hall. After all, the number of divine kings of Qingyu Hall far exceeds ours. If we send out our soldiers to fight, the number of casualties will definitely increase greatly. If we move to another location, we will also expose more weaknesses. It's too difficult. Chapter 4476. The two marshals and the heavenly generals discussed for a while and came to a conclusion. The Prajna fleet was in a dilemma. They were in a very passive situation. In the end, it was the left marshal who made the decision. In my opinion, it would be safer for us to change our position. The people of the Pure Moon Hall were backed by the Seven Moon Mountain, where they had sufficient resources and 180,000 people. No matter how hard we fight back, the Pure Moon Hall will still be able to mobilize more of their people to support us after too many of them are killed or injured. At that time, the Pure Moon Hall will be determined to fight us and we won't be able to win. Logically speaking, Marshall's decision was useless. He had to discuss it with Marshal Sher and get his approval. However, Marshal Sher was in a dilemma. He couldn't lose his authority and dignity as a marshal, but he didn't want to share the responsibility with Marshal Zhou. Therefore, he didn't object to Marshal Zhu's suggestion. In any case, if the Prajna God Emperor found out about this, he would be able to clear his name. Only Marshal Zhu would be punished. Of course, as one of the marshals, he agreed with Marshal Zhu's suggestion. Marshal Zhu can ask the fleet to retreat, but Ben Shui has to remind everyone that we are retreating strategically, not running away. We have to retreat in an orderly manner. Most importantly, we have to defend ourselves when we retreat. We don't want Qingyu Hall to pursue us and cause more casualties. Since Marshal Sher had agreed and put forward a suitable suggestion, this order was quickly passed down and made known to the soldiers on the various divine ships. After a while, the Prajna fleet, which consisted of 400 divine warships, began to retreat to the south. The speed of the fleet's retreat was a little slow. Many of the divine warships changed their positions during the retreat. Every divine warship consumed a huge amount of resources to create the strongest defensive shield. The 400 divine warships combined to create a light ball with a radius of 1,000 miles to block all attacks from the outside world. The master of Qingyu Hall frowned when he saw the Prajna fleet retreating. Damn it! The commander of the Hanya fleet was truly cunning. Originally, they thought that with the increase in casualties, they would definitely be unable to hold back and send out soldiers to fight. I didn't expect that they would choose to retreat, and retreat at such a tortoise-like speed. The master of Qingyu Hall had expected that if the Hanya fleet wanted to change their situation, they only had two choices. It would be good news for the master of Qingyu Hall if the other party sent out soldiers to fight. He could continue to control the desolate antiquity scroll to attack and let the 15,000 people use the formation to attack the enemy. With that, if both sides continued to fight, the Qingyu Hall would be able to whittle down the soldiers of the Hanya fleet and slowly weaken their strength. However, the commander of the Prajna fleet was not stupid. Choosing the lesser of two evils, he decisively chose to retreat. Furthermore, when the fleet retreated, they did not counterattack. Instead, they defended with all their might to minimize the number of casualties. However, there was nothing the master of Qingyu Hall could do. He could only bring his 15,000 people and head south step by step. They followed closely behind the Hanya squadron and continued to attack. When the Hanya fleet retreated, it was difficult for them to maintain a perfect defensive formation, and their defensive strength was greatly reduced. Wasn't the Nine-Dragon Universe formation that the 15,000 people of the Qingyu Hall carefully maintained the same situation? As they moved south and approached the Hanya fleet, the Nine-Dragon Universe formation also showed flaws and deviations, and its strength was greatly reduced. No matter how hard the 15,000 people attacked, they could not reach the lethality of before. They often had to fight for a few rounds before they were able to damage one of the enemy's ships. At the crucial moment, they still had to rely on the desolate antiquity scroll and the other three god items to unleash greater strength and destroy the Hanya fleet's ships. Just like that, both sides fought and retreated, maintaining a distance of 10,000 miles. The situation was extremely tense. As time passed, the casualties of the Hanya fleet accumulated, and the number of remaining ships became fewer and fewer. However, they stabilized their footing and finally started to counterattack. The abilities that the Qingyu Hall's people used together were mostly blocked and dispelled. The pillars of light shot out by the ships were as dense as a rainstorm, bombarding the Qingyu Hall's battle formation and killing many people. While the two sides were fighting, Ji Tianxing had been secretly observing the battle, constantly monitoring the situation in the field. This was the result he wanted. Both sides were evenly matched and both sides had to fight with all their strength. The numbers and strength of both sides were constantly decreasing. Once the balance was broken and one side had the upper hand and was confident of victory, he would find a way to destroy it. Unknowingly, 12 hours had passed. The battle between the two sides lasted from morning until dusk. At this moment, both sides had already advanced 1,000,000 miles south, and were rather far from the Mount of the Seven Moons. In the process, both sides encountered their own subordinates and people. There were 100 or 200 people at most and a dozen at least. These subordinates and people were the ones who had rushed over in batches to support their comrades before the battle began. However, before they reached the scene of the battle, they had already fought with the enemy along the way. The casualties were very tragic. As the Hanya fleet retreated to the south, they encountered the remnants of their subordinates and could only take them in. The Qingyu Hall, on the other hand, was much more relaxed. There was no such trouble, and they could just let the people who had suffered heavy casualties return to the Mount of the Seven Moons to recuperate. At this moment, there were still 360 divine warships and 80,000 soldiers left in the Hanya fleet. As for the 15,000 people of the Qingyu Hall, more than 1,000 had been killed. Only about 13,000 people were left. Furthermore, the continuous outburst of divine power and continuous attacks had exhausted many of the people. They were dispirited and dispirited. The high morale and aggressive aura from before had disappeared. Seeing how tired the people were, the master of Qingyu Hall could only order the 13,000 people to slow down the pace of their attacks. Only half of the people were left to attack, while the other half took the opportunity to rest and recover their divine power. This method was not bad. Although it greatly reduced the power of the attack, it often took a long time to destroy one of the Hanya fleet's divine ships. However, the exhausted people of the Qingyu Hall could quickly replenish their energy while fighting. The master of Qingyu Hall knew that this battle would be a competition of endurance and divine power. It would be very difficult to determine the winner in a short period of time. However, as of now, the Qingyu Hall still had the upper hand. The Hanya fleet had suffered more casualties. Therefore, the master of Qingyu Hall was not afraid that the other party would stall for time and continue to compete in a war of attrition. However, the soldiers of the Hanya fleet had been accumulating their anger and killing intent for a long time. Now they could finally explode. This was because Marshal Zhou believed that the fleet had already retreated to a relatively safe area. Now that the people of the Qingyu Hall were exhausted, it was time for the Hanya fleet to counterattack. Kill. Following Marshal Zhou's order, the soldiers who had been ready for a long time rushed out of the divine ships impatiently. They formed a battle formation in the sky and began to attack. This was the main force of the Hanya fleet. The real battle had finally begun. Chapter 4477. 360 battleships remained in the sky, forming a formation that could attack and defend. Of the 80,000 soldiers, 60,000 were mobilized. They formed an offensive formation within the battle formation formed by the fleets and began to attack. The offensive power of the Hanya fleet instantly increased by 3 times. The 360 battleships released tens of thousands of pillars of god power every 2 breaths, raining down on the formation of the Qingyu Hall. The 60,000 soldiers continued to use their abilities, releasing a sky full of blade lights, sword shadows, lightning and flames. Endless magical powers and magic arts poured down like a torrential flood, drowning the more than 10,000 people of the Pure Moon Hall. The master of Qingyu Hall was a little shocked, not expecting the Hanya fleet to still have such terrifying combat power after fighting for so long. Amidst the shock, he did not forget to give orders, ordering the 13,000 elite citizens to quickly change their formation and defend. Even though they were all exhausted and their combat power had decreased by a lot, the battle had already begun. However, the decisive battle had already begun, and the 13,000 civilians had no choice but to do their best to conjure up a massive defensive shield. At the same time, the master of Qingyu Hall controlled the Desolate Era Scroll, gathering the heaven and earth power within 1,000,000 miles to form a sky-covering barrier. The 2 protectors and the Grand Elder also used all their strength to block the attacks of the Hanya fleet. In the next instant, the sky-covering divine techniques, wind, fire, and lightning smashed into the giant barrier and shield. A loud rumbling sound burst out, reverberating endlessly between the heavens and the earth. The ground within 100,000 miles shook intensely, countless cracks appearing. Many mountains collapsed and forests were destroyed into ruins. The berserk shockwaves spread out in all directions, forming ring after ring of 5-colored ripples. The surrounding mountains and rivers all collapsed into ruins under the berserk shockwaves. From the start of this battle, it was destined that it would not end in a short amount of time. In order to win, both sides did not hold back, going all out. Time passed silently, but the battlefield was fixed there, not moving at all. Rumble. The loud rumbling sound was incessant and had never stopped. The destructive five-colored shockwaves continued to spread in all directions, circle after circle, never stopping. As time passed, the attacking rhythm of the Hanya fleet did not change, and their fighting strength did not weaken by much. On the other hand, it was obvious that the people of Qingyu Hall didn't have enough divine power. The two sides had been fighting for 2 hours. Most of the soldiers' strength had been severely depleted and could not be replenished quickly. It was difficult for them to continue. If it weren't for the master of Qingyu Hall holding the remote antiquity long scroll and the 2 guardians and the Grand Elder holding the 3 divine weapons, the people of Qingyu Hall would have been defeated in large numbers. Of course, the master of Qingyu Hall had already thought of a countermeasure. Compared to the Prajna fleet, the people of Qingyu Hall were more agile and flexible. They could retreat in time if they saw that the situation was not good. As long as they returned to 7 Moon Mountain, the Hanya fleet would not be able to do anything to them. Apart from that, the master of Qingyu Hall also asked the elders under him to send message jade slips to the other hall masters, reporting the cause of the matter. This way, when the battle reached the most dangerous moment, if the Qingyu Hall could not win against the Prajna fleet, they could use the Kongming Temple to suppress the Prajna fleet. The master of Qingyu Hall believed that the commander of the Prajna fleet would have reported the situation to the Prajna god emperor long ago. This was indeed the case. During the battle, marshals took the time to send a message jade slip, telling the Prajna god emperor the most detailed and true situation. At the same time, the headquarters of the faraway Kongming godly palace was located in a secret realm that had seized the fortune of heaven and earth. Within the secret realm, which was hundreds of thousands of miles wide, there was the densest divine power of heaven and earth and the richest treasures. All kinds of cultivation resources could be found everywhere. This was one of the most suitable places in the world for cultivation. Staying in this mystic realm, even if it was an ant or a bird, they would be able to gain sentience and cultivate to the divine Lord realm. It could not be helped. The planet of origin was the origin of the entire universe and the source of power. And this secret realm was one of the rarest secret realms on the planet of origin. In the depths of the secret realm, there was a mountain range with hundreds of majestic palaces and tall buildings. Around each palace and tall building, there were large groups of divine kings and divine lords patrolling and guarding. The palaces and buildings were also luxurious and magnificent, exuding a sacred aura. In the depths of the palaces, in an exquisite and elegant palace, the Prajna god emperor and divine king Xianxia were drinking tea in the study, chatting with a calm expression. Even though there were defensive and secret formations set up in the study and 8 divine king realm guards outside the study, the divine king realm guards didn't dare to attack. But the conversation between the master and disciple might involve some secrets and words that outsiders could not hear. Therefore, the Prajna god emperor was careful with his words and actions, and set up 2 more secret arrays before speaking. The secret realm where the Kongming Temple is located is indeed blessed by the heavens and the most suitable place for cultivation. If you can cultivate in seclusion here for 100 years, you will have a great chance of comprehending the mysteries of the heavenly Tao and breaking through to the God Emperor level. Divine King Xianxia nodded and said with a smile, "We have already arrived at the Kongming Temple's divine palace. We will rest today and see the temple masters tomorrow. When the Kongming Temple has prepared the corresponding ceremony, Master will be able to represent everyone to join the Kongming Temple and become the 6th Temple Master by the day after tomorrow at the latest. As long as Master becomes the Temple Master, I will have many opportunities to come here in the future." Although she did not say it explicitly, her meaning was obvious. In the future, the Prajna god emperor would most likely stay here as the 6th Temple Master. As the disciple of the Prajna god emperor, it was only natural that she would serve her master and cultivate in seclusion in this secret realm for a few hundred years. The Prajna god emperor nodded slightly, her expression as calm as ever, but a hint of worry flashed through her eyes. Logically speaking, everything has gone smoothly since we came into contact with the Qingyu Hall. There have not been any problems or errors. Master will join the Kongming Temple tomorrow at the latest and become the 6th Temple Master. But I don't know why, but I have a vague feeling that something bad is about to happen. The Prajna god emperor had already grasped 3 strands of Tao. Although she was still at the initial stage of the god emperor level, she was not far from the middle stage of the god emperor level. She had also formed a sufficient connection with the heavenly Tao, so it was natural for her to feel something. Divine King Xianxia also understood that her master would not say such things for no reason. But she still smiled and comforted her master. Master, there is no need to worry. The Qingyu Hall has been very warm and polite to us. Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi will also follow your orders and supervise the soldiers. They will not have any conflicts with the Qingyu Hall. Chapter 4478. From Xia's point of view, the Qingyu Hall's attitude was very respectful, and they definitely wouldn't cause trouble. The two marshals would also follow the orders of the Prajna God Emperor and strictly watch over all the soldiers, not allowing them to go out. In this way there would be no conflict between the two sides. Then where did Master's worries come from? The Prajna God Emperor was silent, as if she was sensing the mysteries of heaven and guessing the source of the unease. Xia continued, there shouldn't be any problems between the fleet and the Qingyu Hall. The only thing that could cause Master to feel uneasy should be the Kongming Temple, right? Could it be that the temple lords have different opinions and someone wants to stop us from joining? The Prajna God Emperor sensed for a moment, but the mysteries of heaven were still a bit vague. She couldn't find the source, so she simply stopped thinking about it. Hearing Xia's words, she thought seriously and nodded slightly. After thinking about it, this is probably the only possibility. But the second temple lord said that the other temple lords wanted to invite us to join the Kongming Temple. Because he was from the Flood tribe, he was sent as a representative to talk to me. In that case, the temple lords have no reason to trick me and then refuse us. Xia was speechless. He could only comfort her with a smile. Master, it's most likely because you've been overworked and worried. That's why you're worried. Have a good rest. When you see the temple lords tomorrow, everything will be clear. The Prajna God Emperor felt that this was a possibility, so she didn't dwell on it. Following this, she planned to bring godly monarch Crimson Afterglow around the mystic realm to take a look at its environment. After all, it was very likely that she would be overseeing this place for a long time. But at that moment, a transmission jade slip flew from the sky and stopped in front of her. Looking at the special communication jade slip that was glowing with golden light, Emperor God Panju frowned and his heart skipped a beat. She recognized it at a glance. It was the transmission jade slip she had left for the two marshals. There were only 3 of them and they were used for emergency communication. They were extremely confidential. If it was a normal communication, the two marshals wouldn't use it so easily. Since the two marshals used special jade slips, it meant that there must be something important or news. For the current Hanya God Emperor, the two marshals urgently contacting her was definitely not a good thing. Crimson Afterglow thought of the same thing. His pupils constricted as he stared at the jade slip. He thought to himself, it can't be right? Did something happen to the fleet? The Prajna God Emperor was shrewd and magnanimous enough. Without changing his expression, he picked up the communication jade slip and read its contents with his divine sense. Marshall's voice rang in her mind. That low and somewhat hoarse voice was urgently and solemnly narrating a matter. The Ban Ruo God Emperor's expression changed on the spot. His beautiful face became frosty, and his eyes flashed with anger and killing intent. Seeing his master's reaction, Crimson Afterglow's heart skipped a beat. She'd already guessed that something must have happened to the fleet. It might even have something to do with the Qingyu Hall. There was a conflict and dispute between the two sides. Otherwise, his master's expression wouldn't be so ugly. 100 breaths later, the Ban Ruo God Emperor finished listening to Marshall's message. The Ban Ruo God Emperor had a thorough understanding of what had happened between the fleet and the Qingyu Hall, as well as the details of what had happened in the current situation. Her expression was frosty and her eyes were as sharp as swords. She put away the jade slip and slowly raised her head to look at Crimson Afterglow. At this moment she exuded an awe-inspiring majesty. The fury and killing intent in her eyes made one's heart palpitate. Crimson Afterglow couldn't help but tremble under his master's fierce gaze. What's the matter? Why are you looking at your disciple like that? Crimson Afterglow felt an instinctive fear and panic. The Ban Ruo God Emperor didn't explain in detail. She only said 2 simple sentences. Feiyang Shenwang took the lead in causing trouble. They left the fleet with their soldiers and went out to plunder cultivation resources and treasures. They had a conflict with the people of Qingyu Hall and started killing each other. Since lives were lost, the Qingyu Hall naturally wouldn't let the matter rest. The situation became more and more intense, and now it's an all-out war. More than 10,000 people have died. Crimson Afterglow froze on the spot as if she'd been struck by lightning. This news was too shocking. She'd never thought that the source of her master's uneasiness was the conflict between the fleet and the Qingyu Hall. She'd never thought that the conflict would arise because of Feiyang Shenwang, and that it would escalate to such an extent that the two sides would fight each other to the death. This was too absurd. It was so absurd that she couldn't believe it. Her mind went blank. After a long time she finally came to her senses. She finally understood why her master was so angry and her gaze so fierce. It couldn't be helped. The main culprit was Feiyang Shenwang. Before the Ban Ruo God Emperor left the fleet, she'd repeatedly ordered the two marshals not to allow the soldiers to go out. They were to stay in the divine worship and wait for her orders. However, Feiyang Shenwang not only disobeyed her orders, but also incited the other soldiers to cause trouble. The reason why he had the guts and confidence to go against the two marshals was because of her trust and high regard. In the eyes of the two marshals, Feiyang Shenwang was her confidant. They didn't dare to offend him, so they could only acquiesce. In short, Feiyang Shenwang deserved to die, but she couldn't get away with it. Crimson Afterglow's forehead broke out in cold sweat at this thought. She couldn't wait to find Feiyang Shenwang and cut him into 1,000 pieces. However, this was impossible. She also believed that with Feiyang Shenwang's strength he would have died in the battle long ago. Even if Feiyang Shenwang didn't die, the two marshals who were about to go crazy would probably turn him into ashes. Plop. Without hesitation, Crimson Afterglow knelt in front of the Ban Ruo God Emperor and kowtowed in fear and trepidation. Please calm your anger, master. This disciple was blind and didn't know the right person. This led to such a disaster and caused irreparable losses. This disciple is guilty and should be punished. Master, please punish me severely. Crimson Afterglow had followed the Ban Ruo God Emperor for thousands of years. She knew her master's nature very well. At this time, the more she quibbled, refuted, and shirked responsibility, the angrier her master would be and the worse the punishment would be. On the other hand, if she took the initiative to admit her guilt and ask for punishment without quibbling or shirking responsibility, it would calm her master down. Most importantly, she was her master's most valued disciple. Her master treated her as her own daughter and would never really punish her. As expected, Crimson Afterglow's actions were very wise. The Ban Ruo God Emperor took a deep breath and suppressed his anger. He looked at the prostrating Crimson Afterglow expressionlessly and said in a low voice, "The situation has developed. Now the soldiers are fighting a bloody battle with the people of Qingyu Hall. What's the use of blaming someone at this time? Get up. After I settle this matter, I will punish you." Chapter 4479. Since the Prajna God Emperor had decided not to punish Xianxia for the time being, Xianxia had escaped this calamity. Even if her master were to punish her after this, her anger would have dissipated with the passage of time and would not be too severe. Xianxia secretly heaved a sigh of relief, but at the same time she felt vexed and regretful. She hated that she had listened to Feiyang Shenwang's flowery words and had been tricked into trusting him, resulting in this disaster. Of course, now was not the time to blame herself. The most urgent matter at hand was to resolve the conflict between the fleet and Qingyu Hall. Seeing her master frowning in deep thought, Xianxia hurriedly asked, "Master, what should we do now? Send orders to the two marshals and have them stop the attack immediately?" The Prajna God Emperor raised an eyebrow and said coldly, "The people of Qingyu Hall pretend to be hospitable, but now they are fighting with my soldiers without any mercy. So what if the final battle begins? If there is to be a ceasefire, they should be the first to do so. Otherwise, if I ordered a ceasefire, it would make it seem like I was afraid of them. I have not even joined the Kongming Temple, yet I am already inferior to them. What kind of status will I have in the Kongming Temple in the future?" Xianxia had overlooked this problem and was startled for a moment before nodding. "Master, you are right. It has always been the people of Kongming Temple begging us to join, not the other way around. Those people of Qingyu Hall clearly know that you are about to become the 6th Hall Master, yet they still dare to act so forcefully. They clearly do not respect you. Since that is the case, let them continue to fight. I believe that when the people of Qingyu Hall cannot hold on, they will definitely report to the Hall Masters. When that time comes, the hall masters will definitely reprimand the master of Qingyu Hall and order them to stop the attack. Thinking of the Kongming Temple's attitude and the fact that they had invited them to join the temple, Qixia Deity King felt that they had an advantage. Regardless of whether it was to protect his master's dignity or because he was angry at Qingyu Hall, it was impossible for his master to order the soldiers to stop first. In any case, the soldiers were extremely powerful and had the upper hand at the moment. They definitely wouldn't lose to the people of Qingyu Hall. However, the Prajna God Emperor pondered for a moment, then shook his head and said, "But we can't drag this out for too long. When the two sides fight, there will definitely be soldiers who will be sacrificed. The people of Qingyu Hall were all natives, so they could keep regenerating and multiplying. As for the 100,000 soldiers we brought with us, they won't be able to reproduce and strengthen in a short period of time. If more of them die, our strength will be even weaker." To put it simply, the people of Qingyu Hall could afford to die, but the soldiers of Sanskrit fleet could not. Moreover, as more and more people died on both sides, the hatred would deepen to an irreconcilable level. If it really reached that point, it would depend on how the Kongming Temple would mediate. Perhaps she would no longer be able to join the Kongming Temple. At this thought, the Prajna God Emperor frowned, and his expression became even more gloomy. She had no choice but to release her divine sense to observe the surrounding temples, wanting to see how those temple masters would react. From their reactions, she could more or less determine whether or not they had received the news. However, 15 minutes later, the Prajna God Emperor discovered that everything around her was normal. Those temple masters didn't seem to know about this matter at all. As a result, she couldn't help but feel anxious and conflicted. Should she find the temple masters and explain the situation? Have them give Qingyu Hall an order to have Qingyu Hall immediately stop fighting? In reality, the Prajna God Emperor didn't know that the temple masters had just received a message from the master of Qingyu Hall. Apart from the fifth temple master, the other four temple masters all knew about the battle between the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna fleet. At this moment, the four temple masters were in their respective divine palaces, but they were secretly communicating with each other through a secret array, urgently discussing countermeasures. The first temple master, who had the highest status and the strongest strength, was one of the primordial beings born on the planet of origin. His true form was a mass of chaotic purple gas. However, the image he normally presented to the public was that of a golden-faced man who was more than 10 feet tall and had 2 heads and 4 arms. He had a tower-like figure and a domineering, broad face like a lion. He wore gray armor and a pitch-black cloak all year round. He sat in his study, gazing at the black mirror stone in front of him. He coldly looked at the 3 temple masters and said in a low voice, "You should have all seen the message sent by the master of Qingyu Hall, right?" The wash-basin-sized black mirror stone shone with white light, displaying 3 images, displaying the situation of the 3 temple masters. The second temple master was also in his study, leaning against a wide chair, rubbing his forehead in distress. The third temple master was sitting in a secret chamber with a gloomy face, deep in thought. As for the fourth temple master, he was sitting upright in his room, expressionless. No one could tell what he was thinking. Seeing that everyone was silent and no one took the initiative to speak, the first temple master looked at the second temple master and said in a low voice, "Second temple master, we have all agreed to let you handle this matter. Now something big has happened. The Qingyu Hall and Pan Ra's fleet are locked in a fierce battle, and they have suffered heavy casualties. I would like to hear what you have to say." The second temple master smiled bitterly and said, "To be honest, I did not expect this to happen. Before leaving Mount Seven Moons, I told the master of Qingyu Hall to restrain her people and not to cause trouble. Pan Rua also gave orders to her subordinates that they were not allowed to go out. However, for some reason a portion of the soldiers under Hanya still slipped out. Those bastards left the fleet without permission, and they even wanted to mine resources in veins. They wanted to collect cultivation resources, and they even wanted to steal Qingyu Hall's things. In my opinion, the cause of this matter is the soldiers under Pan Rua's command. Qingyu Hall has indeed been wronged." After hearing his words, the third temple master frowned and expressed a different opinion. "Second temple master, please forgive me for not being able to agree. In my opinion, this is the master of Qingyu Hall's dereliction of duty. He is too muddle-headed. You've already warned him not to cause any trouble. It's not like he doesn't understand how important it is for us to absorb the 100,000 soldiers under Pan Rua's command. So what if Pan Rua's soldiers are collecting resources and robbing them of their resources and treasures? Qin Yu Hall's territory is so big, and there is an endless supply of cultivation resources. Can they use it all up? In the past tens of thousands of years, the temple has given them a lot of cultivation resources and treasures. The master of Qin Yu Hall, that bastard, couldn't hold back because of a small conflict. In the end it got out of hand and he even used the desolate era scroll given by the temple. What a bastard. After a moment of silence, the fourth temple master said slowly, "Thousands of Qin Yu Hall's people died in battle. It's not a big deal. Anyway, the person we are looking for is not among them. However, so many of Pan Rua's soldiers were killed. It is a huge loss to us. If the person we are looking for is among those soldiers, Qin Yu Hall has committed a grave crime." Chapter 4480. The master of Qin Yu Hall knowingly committed a crime, truly abominable to the extreme. After this matter is settled, we must severely punish them. The fourth palace master berated the master of Qin Yu Hall's crimes and was extremely indignant. But then he changed the topic and continued. However, how to punish the master of Qin Yu Hall can be discussed after this matter is settled. The most important thing right now is to have both sides stop fighting as soon as possible to prevent the situation from escalating. Moreover, we can't appear to be too impatient. That way Bo Ri is definitely not a stupid person. Previously, when the second palace master personally went to Seven Moon Mountain to invite her, his attitude was rather intimate and warm. I'm afraid that she has already become suspicious. Now, if we order Qin Yu Hall to stop fighting with her intelligence, she will definitely guess that we have something to ask of her. In the future she will have the upper hand and it will be very difficult for us to get her to cooperate. It was very clear that the Kongming Temple wanted to use the Bo Ri God Emperor and her tens of thousands of soldiers. But they also did not want the Bo Ri God Emperor to think that she and her soldiers were very important and could be used as bargaining chips to negotiate with the Kongming Temple. The palace masters were all silent, pondering how to deal with this thorny matter. They could not let the situation escalate and they could not let the Bo Ri God Emperor see any clues. This was truly too difficult. In the end, it was the first palace master who made the decision. He said with a dignified tone, "Third palace master, fourth palace master, the two of you go find Bo Ri and explain this matter to her face to face. Then you and her will give the order at the same time to order Qin Yu Hall and her fleet to stop fighting. As for who is right and who is wrong, we will wait until the temple investigates clearly before questioning them." The palace masters were all understanding people. They all knew that the responsibility lay with the soldiers of the Bo Ri fleet. But the first palace master said this to smooth things over, to give the Bo Ri God Emperor face and not be too strict. Big matters could be reduced to small matters and small matters could be resolved. For that grand goal, the Kongming Temple could make appropriate concessions. The Prajna God Emperor was hesitating and weighing the pros and cons of whether or not he should seek out the palace masters. At this moment, her divine sense detected two God Emperors flying out from their respective divine palaces towards her. Since he was a God Emperor, there was no doubt that he was the temple master of the Kongming Temple. The Prajna God Emperor heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the two temple masters. In the end, it was the other party who couldn't keep their cool and came to negotiate a ceasefire. This was good too. No matter who spoke first, they would be able to settle this matter as soon as possible. Moments later, the two palace masters arrived at the gates of the divine palace. Naturally, the guards came to report to the Prajna God Emperor. Prajna God Emperor didn't waste any time. He hurriedly brought Crimson Afterglow to the guest hall to meet with the two hall masters. After the two sides met, it was inevitable for them to exchange greetings and introduce themselves. This was the first time the Prajna God Emperor had met the third and fourth hall masters. The two hall masters were very reserved, not as enthusiastic as the second hall master. After the greetings were over, the two hall masters got straight to the point. "Prajna God Emperor, I presume you've already received the message from your soldiers and know what happened at Mount Seven Moons? Because of a few misunderstandings, the soldiers of your fleet and the people of Qin Yu Hall got into a conflict and began fighting. Neither side was able to restrain themselves, causing the conflict to escalate into a large-scale battle." The two hall masters spoke very bluntly without the slightest hint of euphemism. The Prajna God Emperor frowned and expressionlessly asked, This emperor already knows about this matter. Have the two hall masters come to find this emperor to denounce me? Until she was clear about the attitudes and stances of the two hall masters, she naturally had to act tough and cold. The two hall masters hurriedly waved their hands and shook their heads, explaining, "Prajna God Emperor, you've misunderstood. The exact cause and process of the matter have yet to be investigated, so it's impossible to say who's right and who's wrong. Naturally, there's no need for us to denounce you. We are stationed here far too far from Mount Seven Moons. There's no point in trying to determine who's right and who's wrong. We've come to ask for your opinion." The Prajna God Emperor's expression eased up a lot. She nodded slightly and said, "What do the two hall masters plan to do? There's no harm in speaking frankly." The third hall master replied straightforwardly, "Give the order at the same time as we do, ordering Qingyu Hall and your soldiers to cease fighting." The fourth hall master quickly followed up with an explanation. Because of a few misunderstandings and conflicts, causing such a large-scale battle and casualties is far too unwise. Moreover, you and the soldiers under your command are also part of the Temple of Emptiness. To have such internal strife is truly distressing, and it's a great loss to the temple. The last bit of worry in the Prajna God Emperor's heart dissipated. She nodded and said, "To tell you the truth, this emperor also has the same thoughts. I was just about to find you and discuss this matter with you." The two hall masters smiled and nodded in praise. The Prajna God Emperor is able to see the greater good and consider the bigger picture. This seat is deeply gratified. Since the matter has been discussed and you've agreed to cease fighting, we don't need to waste any more time. Let's send the order immediately. Everyone knew that every second they wasted meant more soldiers and civilians would be killed on the battlefield at Mount Seven Moons. There was no time to lose. Once the two sides reached an agreement, they immediately took out their communication jade slips and sent the order. Whoosh! The two hall masters took the lead in issuing the order. Their communication jade slips transformed into streams of light and quickly disappeared over the horizon. A moment later, the communication jade slips would reach the master of Qingyu Hall. At this moment, the Prajna God Emperor also sent out two communication jade slips, one to Marshal Zhou and one to Marshal Shi. Whoosh! The communication jade slips flew out of the divine palace and quickly disappeared. The three looked at each other and smiled, their mood much better. The two hall masters bowed to the Prajna God Emperor and said with a smile, "Since we've reached an agreement on this matter, we'll let both sides rest after the ceasefire. Tomorrow the temple will hold a ceremony to welcome you to the temple. Please make the necessary preparations. After you join the temple and work with us, we'll clean up the mess and investigate and deal with this matter." The Prajna God Emperor nodded in agreement. "Very well. I'll have to trouble the hall masters." After that, the two hall masters bowed and took their leave, leaving the divine palace. The Prajna God Emperor had Crimson Dawn send the guests off. She left the reception hall and returned to her study, where she quietly pondered. The third hall master and the fourth hall master clearly know that the cause of this matter is the soldiers under this emperor's command. But they didn't denounce us. Instead, they took the attitude of making a big deal out of a small one. They're giving this emperor a way out and they want to settle this matter. It seems that the Kongming Temple is plotting something against this emperor and my soldiers, and they're plotting something big. The Prajna God Emperor secretly pondered. Then she thought of the riddle of eternal life that the second hall master had mentioned before, and a bold idea emerged in her mind. The only thing that can make the Kongming Temple go through so much trouble and even swallow their anger is probably the riddle of eternal life. Could it be that this emperor and my soldiers are the key to solving the riddle of eternal life? The Book House Reading Website. Chapter 4481. After the Prajna God Emperor and the Hall Masters sent out the message, they waited in the Divine Palace for news and feedback. On the other side, the battle between the Prajna fleet and the Qingyu Hall was still going on. There were only 11,000 people left in the Qingyu Hall. They were still in a battle formation, relying on the desolate era-long scroll and the 3 divine artifacts to share most of the pressure. Even so, the exhausted people of the Qingyu Hall had lost most of their will to fight, and their combat strength had decreased greatly. However, they still couldn't withstand the counterattack of the Prajna fleet. More than 3,600 people had already been killed by the Prajna fleet. Every second, there were people who had used up all of their divine power and couldn't hold on any longer. They died tragically in the light pillars and sword shadows, their bodies smashed into pieces. The master of Qingyu Hall, the two protectors and the elders were also under great pressure. Their faces were pale and their bodies were drenched in cold sweat. Although they weren't injured yet, they had used up a lot of their divine power. However, their divine power was greatly depleted, and their minds were also shaken and injured. Their battle prowess was gradually declining. Based on the current situation, they could at most hold on for another hour before they ran out of energy and retreated. At that time, the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors and the elders wouldn't be able to hold on, and their people would be defeated. They could only choose to retreat to Seven Moon Mountain, and they would be chased by the Prajna fleet, suffering heavy casualties along the way. On the other hand, the Prajna fleet was still attacking at full strength. In the previous battle, only 10 divine warships were destroyed and more than 800 soldiers were killed. For the entire fleet, this amount of casualties didn't matter. On the contrary, it ignited the bloodlust and killing intent of the tens of thousands of soldiers, causing their morale to soar. For a moment, Marshal Zhou didn't want to stop the battle. He had the urge to continue fighting and take over Seven Moon Mountain. However, he quickly calmed down. After weighing the pros and cons, he felt that there was no benefit in doing so. Instead, it would cause the relationship between the two sides to collapse. Therefore, the Prajna fleet had the upper hand and it was best to reduce the casualties. When the Prajna God Emperor gave the order, he still had to follow it. In short, he had to make the Qingyu Hall pay a heavy price, but he couldn't destroy the Qingyu Hall. Even if the two sides reconciled in the future, the Qingyu Hall would still have to lower their attitude in front of the Prajna fleet. The Prajna fleet had to be the victor and Qingyu Hall could only be the loser. Unknowingly, 15 minutes passed. The Prajna fleet's morale was Prajna fleet's army's soldiers' Hall army, and Qingyu Hall's soldiers', and their morale was once again their morale, the army's army, as soldiers' army. Right at this time, 2 communication jade slips arrived at Sanskrit fleet at almost the same time, flying before Marshal left and Marshal Sure. Emperor God Emperor Gods is God Emperors a God Emperor Emperor God Emperors and Lord is God of the God at the of the God Emperor God Halls. But the Prajna God Emperor naturally had her reasons for doing so. Furthermore, this would prove that she was fair and impartial without any bias and that she trusted both marshals. Marshal Sure was filled with anticipation. He opened the communication jade slip and listened to the orders of the God Emperor. He really wanted to know if the Prajna God Emperor was dissatisfied with Marshal Zhou or even angry. Moreover, when he reported the situation before, he had already cleared his name and most likely would not be implicated. If the Prajna God Emperor was disappointed in Marshal Zhou and even ordered him to be severely punished, then he would be able to gain the trust and respect of the Prajna God Emperor. However, when Marshal Sure heard the Prajna God Emperor's message, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. The Prajna God Emperor only ordered the fleet to stop attacking and retreat to a safe distance to heal and comfort the soldiers. The Prajna God Emperor didn't say much about Marshal Zhou's mistake. She only said that the matter would be settled and the punishment would be carried out after the matter was investigated. Marshal Sure was very smart. He understood a few things from the Prajna God Emperor's tone. First of all, the Prajna God Emperor was very angry and disappointed at this accident. But it had already happened. The Prajna God Emperor's focus wasn't on who caused the accident or who should be punished. What she cared more about was the attitude of the Qingyu Hall and the outcome of this battle. Her point of view was very clear. Both sides could stop fighting, but only when the Prajna fleet had the upper hand. No matter what, she couldn't weaken her reputation and make her lose her status and prestige in the Kongming Temple. This point was also within Marshal Sure's expectations. It was very much in line with the Prajna God Emperor's character. But he was still disappointed that he didn't get the result he wanted. On the other side, Marshal Zhou was full of anxiety. He opened the communication jade slip with a complicated expression. He was well aware that such a big mess would affect the overall situation, especially the Prajna God Emperor's plan. No matter how angry the Prajna God Emperor was, no matter how severe the punishment was, he was mentally prepared. But when Marshal Zhou heard the Prajna God Emperor's order, he was stunned. He didn't expect that the Prajna God Emperor's tone was only cold and harsh. The main thing was that the Prajna God Emperor was giving an order, and she also mentioned that she would punish the wrongdoer later. Even the Prajna God Emperor didn't mention Marshal Zhou's name, nor did she get angry at him. This surprised him quite a bit but also made him feel very grateful. He respected and admired the Prajna God Emperor even more. He secretly made up his mind that after this matter was settled, he would take the initiative to apologize to the Prajna God Emperor and sincerely repent. Then he solemnly put away the communication jade slip and contacted Marshal Shur with his divine sense. The two marshals didn't say much. After confirming the Prajna God Emperor's order, they began to carry it out. Very quickly they passed down Pan Rua God Emperor's orders, and through the various divine generals, it reached the ears of the soldiers. More than 300 divine warships and tens of thousands of soldiers began to reduce their firepower in an orderly manner. They gradually stopped their attacks and slowly retreated. At the same time, the master of Qingyu Hall also received the message from the hall masters and began to carry out the order to stop the battle. The master of Qingyu Hall repeatedly told his people to reduce their firepower and retreat in an orderly manner. But these people didn't have enough combat experience and they were very tired. Their divine power was very weak. As a result, when the order to stop the battle was given, many people suddenly reduced their firepower and even stopped attacking. As a result, the defense of the Qingyu Hall was weakened by 70%. Naturally, there were heavy casualties. In just a few breaths, more than 1,000 people were annihilated under the indiscriminate bombardment of the Prajna fleet. The master of Qingyu Hall's heart ached when he saw this. He was so angry that his eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He couldn't wait to tear the people of the Prajna fleet into pieces. But things had already come to this point. He could only take the big picture into consideration. He suppressed his anger and ordered his people to gradually stop the battle. It seemed that the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna fleet were showing signs of wanting to stop the battle. Ji Tianxing, who had been hiding in the dark and observing the situation, finally couldn't help but make a move. Chapter 4482. Ji Tianxing's goal was to make the Qingyu Hall and the Hanya fleet kill each other and completely break off their relationship. Most importantly, he wanted to make the Hanya God Emperor unable to join the Kongming Temple and rely on such a powerful backer. He was about to succeed, but at the last moment the two sides had to stop fighting. How could he let that happen? Coincidentally, the master of Qingyu Hall had to use all his strength to activate the Desolate Era Scroll in order to cover the retreat of his people and reduce the casualties as much as possible. Boom! The Desolate Era Scroll gathered the power of heaven and earth within 1,000,000 miles to form a double barrier that covered the sky and the sun, protecting the 10,800 people. At the same time, the Desolate Era Scroll also released hundreds of torrential light beams that shot towards the Hanya fleet to block the bombardment of the divine warships. Under normal circumstances, the master of Qingyu Hall would have a hard time hurting the divine warships and soldiers of the Hanya fleet. He could only block the enemy's attacks and ensure the safety of his people. However, Ji Tianxing decisively seized the opportunity and secretly released powerful divine power. He mixed it with the sky full of divine light and sword shadows and blasted it towards the Hanya fleet. Unbeknownst to everyone, the power of the Desolate Era Scroll's divine power increased by several times. Boom! Bang! 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 Hundreds of five-colored torrents hit the Hanya fleet like sharp swords that could split heaven and earth. As for the tens of thousands of sword shadows that covered the sky, they didn't have much power and couldn't pose a threat to the Hanya fleet. Amidst a world-shaking boom, the defensive light barrier of the Hanya fleet was directly blasted to pieces, shooting out fragments that filled the sky. More than 3,000 soldiers were drowned by the five-colored torrent. Their bodies were crushed on the spot and turned into ashes. More than a dozen divine warships were also struck by the terrifying five-colored light pillars. They were blown to smithereens and turned into wreckage. In the blink of an eye, the Hanya fleet lost 4,000 soldiers and 16 warships. Such a shocking scene not only stunned Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shur, but even the master of Qingyu Hall and the protectors and elders were all stunned. Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shur stared at the people of Qingyu Hall with eyes that were about to pop out of their sockets. They couldn't help but roar, "Damn bastard, he was hiding his strength all this time until we were about to stop fighting. Only then did he use the trump card of that divine artifact when we weren't prepared." The master of Qingyu Hall is a despicable bastard. Seeing that the two sides were about to stop fighting, he actually gave us a vicious attack on us. This is absolutely intolerable. No matter what I say, I can't let him be happy. An eye for an eye. The Hanya Yu Hall's view Yu Hall's Hall, as Hanya Yu Hall's is to stop fighting back. However, when the Hanya fleet attacked with all their strength, even if the master of Qingyu Hall used the killer move of the long desolate era scroll, it would still be very difficult to heavily injure the Hanya fleet. Only when the two sides stopped fighting and retreated when the Hanya fleet wasn't prepared could the master of Qingyu Hall's sneak attack succeed. This was too despicable, too despicable. Therefore, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi ordered the soldiers to stop retreating and attack with all their strength. They had to destroy the Qingyu Hall. They even had to force the master of Qingyu Hall to admit defeat and beg for mercy before they could vent their anger. Anyway, the God Emperor of Qingyu Hall had already expressed his attitude. Both sides could stop fighting, but the Hanya fleet had to show their strength. They couldn't lose. Kill those despicable bastards of the Qingyu Hall. Charge. Immediately, angry roars and shouts sounded from the Hanya fleet again. Tens of thousands of soldiers and more than 300 divine warships attacked with all their strength again. Over at the Qingyu Hall's side, the master of Qingyu Hall and the protectors and elders finally came back to their senses. Seeing the terrifying destructive power of the long desolate era scroll, everyone was filled with shock. They couldn't help but mutter, "Heavens! The power of the long desolate era scroll is actually this strong? This must be the hidden killer move of the long desolate era scroll, right? Why didn't the Hall Master use it before? Could it be that it can only be used once in a short period of time? Or did the Hall Master purposely leave it until the end, and when the Hanya fleet wasn't prepared he gave them a heavy blow?" Not to mention the protectors and elders, even the master of Qingyu Hall was stupefied. They looked at the long desolate era scroll in their hands, and then looked at the Hanya fleet that had suffered heavy casualties. At this moment, earth-shattering shouts sounded from the Hanya fleet. The divine robes of the more than 300 divine warships lit up with resplendent divine light again, releasing 5 colored pillars of light that covered the sky and earth. Tens of thousands of soldiers gathered their morale again, and attacked with murderous intent. The citizens of the Qingyu Hall that were in the middle of a ceasefire and retreating immediately felt a huge pressure, as if they could smell the scent of death. For a moment, countless citizens were somewhat flustered. The master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors, and the elders all felt their hearts skip a beat, and knew that the situation was not good. It's over. The Hanya fleet's people have been enraged and are going to fight us to the death. Damn it! Didn't we agree on a ceasefire? Why are they acting like they've gone mad? Everyone, don't just stand there, quickly command everyone to resist with all their strength. The master of Qingyu Hall didn't have time to think, and could only use all his strength to control the long desolate era scroll, and do his best to condense a defensive barrier to protect his citizens. Unfortunately, the citizens of the Qingyu Hall didn't have enough battle experience, and even though they hurriedly cast spells to resist again, it was already too late and the effect was minimal. More importantly, while the Hanya fleet was fighting back with all their strength, Ji Tianxing, who only wanted to see the world plunged into chaos, took the opportunity to add fuel to the fire. He quietly released thousands of divine light beams, and mixed them with the flashes of blades and shadows of swords in the sky, and attacked the citizens of the Qingyu Hall. Bam, 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 boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, tens of thousands of divine light beams and flashes of blades and shadows of swords drowned more than 10,000 citizens of the Qingyu Hall, and earth-shattering noises burst out. At first, the defensive barrier condensed by the long desolate era scroll was shattered into pieces and exploded. Then many citizens were drowned by the flashes of blades and shadows of swords, and countless people were minced into pieces of flesh. Exclamations and screams filled the sky. At this moment, the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors, and the elders were furious and helpless, and their eyes turned scarlet. They couldn't believe that the Hanya fleet's all-out counterattack had such terrifying destructive power. In just one exchange, more than 2,000 citizens died tragically in the sky full of divine light, and turned into ashes and dust. More than 1,000 citizens were severely injured and their blood was dripping. It was a horrible sight to behold. 2 elders and a few deacons were also killed on the spot, and not even their bones were left behind. Ever since the two sides started the battle, the Qingyu Hall had only lost about 4,000 citizens. In just one breath, the Qingyu Hall had lost more than 2,000 people, and more than 1,000 people had lost the ability to fight. This was simply too terrifying. All kinds of thoughts flashed through everyone's minds. Are the people of the Hanya fleet crazy? Could it be that they were also hiding their strength before and this is their real combat power? Damn it! These despicable and vicious invaders are murdering our citizens so cruelly. This is an irreconcilable grudge. This is too much. Even if we have to disobey the orders of the Hallmasters, we must avenge our dead people. The Book Guesthouse Reading Website. Chapter 4483. The Pure Moon Hall had suffered heavy casualties. The surviving members of the Pure Moon Hall were all furious. The Hall Master of the Pure Moon Hall, the Guardians of Dharma, and the Elders all went berserk. The 8,000 citizens were roaring furiously. Their potential had been stimulated. They had used up all their energy and were very weak. But now they were full of fighting spirit and killing intent. On the other hand, the people of the Prajna fleet were stunned. Even Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi were shocked. They couldn't believe their eyes. They simply couldn't believe that the power of their counterattack was actually so powerful and so destructive. For a moment, the two marshals and the many divine generals had the same thought. Could it be that the soldiers' potential was stimulated by their anger? Maybe it's because the people of the Qinyu Hall are at the end of their rope and are retreating. That's why they are so weak. Since our fleet is so powerful, what are we afraid of? We must beat the Pure Moon Hall to a pulp and make them admit defeat. Humph. Despicable Qinyu Hall. How dare you play dirty with us? Let's show you how powerful we are. Everyone felt relieved. At the same time, their confidence was boosted. They were determined to beat the crap out of the Qinyu Hall. The Qinyu Hall was also infuriated. Under the leadership of the Master of Qinyu Hall, they launched a counterattack. The Master of Qinyu Hall controlled the Desolate Antiquity Scroll. He didn't hesitate to consume his own life to increase his combat power by 3 times. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Suddenly, the heaven and earth in a 2-million-mile radius started to shake. The terrifying divine power of heaven and earth gathered into billions of swords and sabers, attacking the Prajna fleet from all directions. Dozens of purple chi dragons also shot out from the Desolate Antiquity Scroll and attacked the Prajna fleet. As for the other protectors, elders, and citizens, there was no need to say anything. They all unleashed their full strength without regard for anything else and used their trump cards. When all the divine abilities and spells were gathered together, their power was unimaginably strong, and their momentum was also very great. Dazzling divine light, billions of sword lights, wind, fire, and lightning drowned the Hanya fleet like a flood. Ji Tianxing could see everything clearly. Even though the 8,000 characters of Qinyu Hall had retaliated with hatred and had unleashed their most powerful trump cards and ultimate skills, they were still unable to do anything. However, these people were strong on the outside but weak on the inside. Their strength had long been exhausted and they were only holding on with their minds. The divine spells they cast only seemed to be powerful, but their power and destructive power were not strong enough. At the very least, the combined counterattack of these 8,000 civilians was far from enough to heavily injure Hanya's fleet. Ji Tianxing of course had to add fuel to the fire. He secretly used a few ultimate techniques to strengthen the Qinyu Hall. In any case, the saber light and sword shadows that he secretly used were mixed in with the brilliance of the divine arts that filled the sky. It was impossible to tell them apart. Rumble. The outcome satisfied both Ji Tianxing and Qinyu Hall. Following a deafening explosion, the defensive barriers formed by the Hanya fleet were all smashed to pieces. Another 20 divine warships were blown to pieces. More than 3,000 soldiers died on the spot and more than 2,000 people were severely injured. Such heavy casualties caused a huge hole and gap to appear in the battle formation of the Hanya fleet. Their defensive power was a lot weaker. The destructive shockwaves also hit all the warships, making it difficult for the soldiers to quickly restore their formation. The officers and soldiers of the Sanskrit fleet were naturally infuriated after suffering such a miserable slaughter. They roared and cursed hysterically. At the same time, the soldiers also lost their minds and launched a desperate counterattack. Even Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi temporarily put aside the order of the Hanya God Emperor. The two of them thought that the Hanya fleet could stop fighting, but they couldn't accept such a humiliating result. And they couldn't be fooled by the Qinyu Hall. If the Qinyu Hall didn't want to make peace, then don't blame them for being merciless. They'll beat you until you kneel and beg for mercy. Thus, under the command of the two marshals, all the remaining divine warships, including the 20,000 soldiers who had been biding their time, all joined the battle. Only now did the Hanya fleet join the battle without holding back. Swoosh. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. 300 divine warships fired their divine cannons at the same time, releasing tens of thousands of beams of light that rained down on the people of the Qingyu Hall. Tens of thousands of soldiers also formed battle formations and joined forces to use all kinds of divine arts and secret techniques, bombarding the people of the Qingyu Hall indiscriminately. With the previous experience, both sides fought with all their might. They didn't stop or stand still. Both sides didn't take turns to attack each other. Instead, they continued to attack without stopping. Suddenly, the divine arts that blotted out the sky clashed fiercely between heaven and earth, producing a deafening sound. The fragments of divine light that splashed out were surrounded by rings of 5-colored torrents. They spread in all directions, engulfing everything within a radius of 100,000 miles. The Hanya fleet clearly had the upper hand and could definitely suppress the people of the Qingyu Hall, forcing them to flee. However, Ji Tianxing was secretly interfering. He always helped the Qingyu Hall increase their firepower and severely damaged the soldiers of the Hanya fleet. Thus, both sides were actually locked in battle. It was impossible to determine the victor in a short period of time. As for the casualties, both sides were very tragic. Every second, hundreds of people were killed. Just like this, the Hanya fleet and the people of the Qingyu Hall went crazy. They lost their minds and fought a bloody battle. The situation on the battlefield gradually went out of control. The formations of both sides became fragmented and the battlefield began to scatter. However, no one noticed any clues and no one suspected that someone was secretly interfering. Both sides thought that the other side had been hiding their strength until now. They cursed the other side for being sinister and despicable. Unknowingly, an hour had passed. This chaotic and cruel battle was finally coming to an end. At this time, the Hanya fleet had 180 divine warships left. There were less than 40,000 survivors. More than 10,000 of them were severely injured and had lost their ability to fight. More than 4,000 of the 8,000 people of the Qingyu Hall had been killed. Of the 3,000 survivors, more than half of them were severely injured. It was a tragic sight. Even the 1,000 survivors who weren't injured had used up all their strength and almost lost their ability to fight. Most importantly, the battlefield had expanded to a radius of 100,000 miles. It was divided into 6 or 7 groups of people. In one area, more than a dozen divine warships were attacking more than 200 Qingyu Hall citizens. In another area, more than 20 divine warships were attacking more than 300 Qingyu Hall citizens. This was the moment when Ji Tianxing took advantage of the chaos and completely messed up the situation. He cruised around the battlefield in secret, destroying one divine battleship after another and killing batch after batch of people of the Pure Moon Hall. The soldiers and citizens of both sides were killed one after another in confusion. The number of survivors decreased sharply. Chapter 4484. Before the final battle broke out, the people of the Prajna fleet thought that they would definitely win. The master of Qingyu Hall and the 8,000 people of the Prajna fleet also thought that they had no advantage and that it was unlikely for them to win. But in the end, the 2 marshals and the divine generals of the Prajna fleet were dumbfounded. They had never expected that the battle with the people of Qingyu Hall would end in a lose-lose situation. On the 7 battlefields, the Prajna fleet only had about 50 divine warships and less than 10,000 soldiers, and half of them were injured. Looking at the 8,000 people of Qingyu Hall, only about 1,000 of them were still alive, and all of them were in a sorry state. Within a radius of 100,000 miles, all the mountains and rivers had disappeared. They had been razed to the ground and turned into ruins. The ground was full of wreckage and fragments of warships. Corpses, blood, and divine weapon fragments were scattered all over the ground. It was a tragic scene. On the surface, it seemed that the Prajna fleet had the advantage in numbers and had won. But in reality, the 10,000 surviving soldiers of the Prajna fleet were about the same as the 1,000 people of Qingyu Hall. Fortunately, both sides had fought until the end, and their divine powers had been exhausted, so they could not unleash much power. If both sides were at their peak and continued to fight, it was very likely that they would be completely wiped out. Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi were completely dumbfounded. Looking at the remaining 10,000 soldiers and 50 divine warships, they even wanted to commit suicide. It's over. We are completely done for. We had 100,000 soldiers and more than 400 divine warships, but now there are only a few left and they are badly injured. There is no need for God Emperor to give us any punishment. We should just kill ourselves. How could this be? We clearly had the upper hand and completely suppressed the people of Qingyu Hall. Why did it end up like this when we were only careless for an hour? There are only 10,000 severely injured soldiers left. How are we going to explain this to God Emperor? The two marshals' hearts were dead and they were filled with despair. Many divine generals were also at a loss for what to do. Fortunately, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi quickly calmed down. They looked at each other and gave orders at the same time. Retreat. All soldiers listen up. Retreat immediately. At this point they could no longer care about the dignity and dignity of God Emperor of Prajna fleet. Stopping the losses in time and saving the 10,000 soldiers was the most important thing. At this point they were still thinking about defeating Qingyu Hall and forcing Qingyu Hall to surrender. On the other hand, the master of Qingyu Hall and the guardians and elders of Qingyu Hall. They looked at the 1,000 survivors and saw the miserable state they were in. They were all frightened and shocked. They were God Emperor Prajna, God Emperor Prajna fleet divine weapon of Qingyu. God Gods Prajna divine God God. Qing be half Prajna be out of their God half of Qing Prajna fleet and Ina fleet. This was a fatal blow to Qingyu Hall. 70% of the god kings that Qingyu Hall had accumulated over tens of thousands of years had perished in this battle. 95% of the high-level divine lords that they had cultivated over tens of thousands of years had perished. It could be said that the backbone of Qingyu Hall had been destroyed. Without 20 to 30,000 years, Qingyu Hall would not be able to recover its strength. The master of Qingyu Hall blamed himself and regretted his actions. He hated Prajna fleet even more. Now the result was as he had said before. Both sides had a blood feud that was irreconcilable. It's over. Qingyu Hall's hard work over tens of thousands of years has been destroyed. Qingyu Hall only exists in name now. I'm afraid that the Temple of God will merge us with other halls when they hear about this. That damned Prajna God Emperor. It's all because of those bastards under her command. The guardians and elders were filled with despair and anger. Their faces were distorted as they cursed and discussed with hoarse voices. Luckily, the master of Qingyu Hall was still able to suppress his anger and maintain his rationality. He decisively gave the order to retreat. He used the last of his strength to cover the retreat of Qingyu Hall's citizens. Of course, as both sides were retreating, there were still some casualties, but it did not affect them much. After 100 breaths of time, both sides separated and retreated. Soon, the 1,000 citizens of Qingyu Hall gathered together under the master of Qingyu Hall's command. The hall master of Pure Moon didn't say anything, nor did she say anything harsh to the Prajna fleet. She only glared at the Prajna fleet viciously, then turned around and led her people back to the Seven Moon Mountain. If Prajna fleet won, they would not have suffered many casualties. They could still chase after the master of Qingyu Hall and the others. However, they had suffered heavy casualties. They only had 50 godly warships and 10,000 soldiers left. How would they dare to chase after the master of Qingyu Hall? In comparison, their losses were even greater and their situation was even more dangerous. After all, Qingyu Hall had lost 14,000 elites in this battle, but there were still 180,000 citizens left on Seven Moon Mountain. As for Prajna fleet's 100,000 soldiers, only 10,000 were left. They could not expand their population in a short period of time. This was the most fatal blow. Even if they did not fight with Qingyu Hall anymore, no matter where Prajna fleet went, they had lost the right to compete with the other halls. Furthermore, the two sides had already formed a blood feud. It was unknown whether Prajna God Emperor could still join the Kongming Temple. After the 50 godly warships gathered, they quietly retreated to the south under the guidance of the two marshals. The fleet would retreat to a safe area and allow all the soldiers to recuperate and recover. As the fleet retreated, Marshal Zhou and Marshal Shi met and looked at each other with bitter expressions. What should we do? Now that things have come to this, what can we do? Should we send a message to the God Emperor and report the results truthfully? Of course we should report the truth. However, the culprit is Qingyu Hall. Whether or not the God Emperor can forgive us, it has already happened. There is no point in running away. We should face it bravely. This time, Marshal Shi had also participated in this grave mistake. He could not shirk his responsibility. He had also given up on this idea and accepted his fate. Marshal Zhou did not say anything else. He took out a special communication jade slip and was about to send a message to Prajna God Emperor. However, when the words came to his mouth, he could not help but shrink back. He passed the jade slip to Marshal Shi. You should report it. I have let down the God Emperor's trust. I have no face to say anything else. Marshal Shi understood his feelings and did not refuse. He took the communication jade slip and began to report the situation. Whoosh! The communication jade turned into a stream of light and disappeared into the dark sky. The two marshals quietly looked up at the sky and stood there for a long time without saying a word. They were waiting for Prajna God Emperor's reply, and also waiting for the judgment of fate. Translator, King Bao Editor, Dark Gem. Chapter 4485. The headquarters of the faraway Kongming Temple was located in the Realm of Emptiness. The palaces in the depths of the Realm of Emptiness were majestic and sacred. In several magnificent palaces, the temple masters and the Prajna God Emperor were patiently waiting for news. It had been more than an hour since they had issued the order to stop the battle. In their opinion, after so long, the Qingyu Hall and the Prajna fleet should have stopped fighting. Moreover, both sides should have retreated to a safe place to recuperate, right? Why hadn't the master of Qingyu Hall and marshals was sent a message to report the latest situation after so long? The master of Qingyu Hall and the two marshals wouldn't dare to disobey orders. Could there have been some kind of accident? The temple masters and the Prajna God Emperor had this question in their minds. As time passed, the Prajna God Emperor and the temple masters couldn't wait any longer. They wanted to send another message to question the master of Qingyu Hall and the two marshals. At this moment, several streams of light flew from the sky and landed in the hands of the Prajna God Emperor and the temple masters. Seeing that the communication jade slips had finally arrived, everyone was secretly relieved. They hurriedly opened the jade slips to check the information inside. However, when they finished reading the information in the jade slips and learned the final situation of the battle, their expressions changed dramatically. Especially Ban Ruo Emperor God, his eyes went black and he was so angry that he almost spat out blood. Yes, her soldiers and the Qingyu Hall had indeed stopped fighting. However, she didn't expect that the two sides had stopped fighting not because of her order, but because the two sides had been fighting for so long that there weren't many soldiers left and they had to stop fighting. She had brought 100,000 soldiers to the planet of origin. Now, before she could gain a foothold on the planet of origin, she had suffered such a heavy blow that only 10,000 soldiers were left. Moreover, those 10,000 soldiers were all injured, light or heavy. It was impossible for them to recover in a short period of time. This was like a bolt from the blue. The Prajna God Emperor was so angry that she almost went crazy. If the two marshals were standing in front of her, she most likely wouldn't be able to suppress her anger and kill them. She was so angry that her whole body trembled, her face was pale, and her entire body was filled with a chilling, killing intent. When Xianxia saw her reaction, he had a premonition that the situation was not good, and he was extremely anxious. However, she didn't dare to ask questions while her master was burning with anger. On the other side, the hall masters were also dumbfounded on the spot. They only felt anger and helplessness. What made them angry was that hall leader Pure Moon had disobeyed them. Prajna God Emperor had ordered a ceasefire, but she had still refused to stop fighting, and had to kill the Prajna dynasty's fleet. Such audacity and recklessness, acting willfully without regard for the consequences, and causing such a great disaster, did they not deserve to die? To the hall masters, the tens of thousands of deaths caused by this great battle were very serious, but they were still barely able to accept it. But now that things had escalated to this point, it was impossible for Hanya God Emperor to join the Temple of Kongming. This was the result that they could not accept. It's over. Our previous efforts were all in vain. Damn that master of Qingyu Hall. How dare she be so reckless? In my opinion, there's no need to hold tomorrow's ceremony. Prajna can't join us. Sigh. The initial cause was just a trivial matter. How could it have developed to this point? She ruined our plan. The master of Qingyu Hall deserves to die. Everyone saw that Prajna also received the message jade slip. She also knows about this news. Let's not waste any more time. Let's think about how to appease Prajna and if there's any chance of getting her back. The temple masters discussed secretly and quickly made a decision. The second temple master led the third temple master and the fourth temple master to talk to Prajna. When the three temple masters came to Prajna's palace, Prajna also brought Xianxia God King and a group of guards to leave the palace. The two sides met in the square in front of the palace. They stopped at the same time. The atmosphere was very awkward. Prajna God Emperor was still angry. Her face was still cold and her body was full of killing intent. But she had already calmed down. Her expression was cold and her eyes were cold. She didn't do anything unusual. She looked at the three temple masters indifferently and said, "I have already guessed the purpose of your visit. But you don't need to say anything. I have already made up my mind." Hearing her cold and indifferent tone, the three temple masters knew that this matter was difficult to resolve. But since they were already here, they had to say a few words and express their attitude before leaving. Maybe if they showed enough sincerity, Prajna God Emperor would hesitate and give them another chance? So the second temple master cupped his hands and said, "Prajna, the situation has developed to this point. We can't control or predict it. It's also a result we don't want to see. No matter what the cause is, that master of Qingyu Hall dared to disobey orders and cause such a disaster. I will give you an explanation. Please stay for a few more days. See how I punish that bastard." The third temple master and the fourth temple master also said, "Prajna God Emperor, we are both very sincere. It's just that it's hard to restrain our subordinates. Their mistakes shouldn't affect our decision. This is the method and determination of a superior. Prajna God Emperor, even though the situation has developed to this point, our Kongming Temple still welcomes you with open arms. I hope you can consider carefully and not be impulsive." Prajna God Emperor looked at the three temple masters expressionlessly and said indifferently, "How you want to punish the master of Qingyu Hall is your Kongming Temple's matter. It has nothing to do with me. I am willing to believe in your sincerity. But since the situation has developed to this point, how can I join the Kongming Temple? If I really agree, how can I face the 90,000 soldiers who died? How can I face the 10,000 soldiers who survived? In short, it's impossible for me to join the Kongming Temple. You three temple masters don't need to persuade me. If you are still willing to respect me, then please leave and let me go back to deal with this matter." Seeing that she was really stubborn, the third temple master and the fourth temple master frowned and hesitated. The second temple master sighed helplessly and asked, "Forget it. Since you have made up your mind, I won't persuade you anymore. However, I want to ask you something. Prajna, what do you plan to do next?" Prajna God Emperor said indifferently, "Naturally, I will deal with the aftermath of this matter and appease the soldiers who survived." The second temple master was silent for a moment. Then he said in a serious tone, "Prajna, since you are not willing to join me, I hope this matter will end here. You can appease the soldiers or you can take them to a faraway place and leave my territory. But if you have thoughts of taking revenge and destroying Qingyu Hall, I will remind you that it's best to dispel those thoughts." Chapter 4486. When the second palace master smiled, he was very kind and amiable. But when he put on a serious face, he could also be very dignified. His serious tone contained a hint of intimidation. And the meaning he expressed was not only the Kongming Temple's attitude, but also the Pan-Ruo God Emperor's expectations. Yes, the Pan-Ruo God Emperor was willing to join the Kongming Temple, so everyone was a family. Anything could be discussed and reconciled. But if the Pan-Ruo God Emperor insisted on not joining the Kongming Temple, then the two sides would be strangers. There was no need to talk about friendship or face. Even if the master of Qingyu Hall had made a big mistake, Qingyu Hall was still a part of the Kongming Temple. Those hundreds of thousands of people were all citizens of Qingyu Hall. If the Pan-Ruo God Emperor wanted to take revenge and deal with the people of Qingyu Hall, then she would be the Kongming Temple's enemy. The more enthusiastic the Kongming Temple was when they tried to persuade her to join the Kongming Temple, the more cruel they would be when they dealt with her in the future. The Pan-Ruo God Emperor naturally thought of this and knew the severity of the consequences. But her thoughts did not waver and her will would not change because of this. But she was still in the Kongming secret realm. In front of the three palace masters she could not show it. Otherwise, if the two sides fell out and really fought, Xianxia and the others would not be able to leave alive. And so, the Pan-Ruo God Emperor bowed slightly without changing her expression and said calmly, "Thank you for the reminder, second palace master. But you worry too much. This emperor has been to the Kongming secret realm before and knows the strength of the Kongming Temple. Why would I do something unwise? Since she had already expressed that she would not pursue the matter or seek revenge, the three palace masters did not say anything more. They cupped their hands and bowed to her, then stepped aside to let her pass. The Pan-Rua God Emperor bid farewell to the three palace masters and left with Xianxia and the guards. Whoosh, whoosh. Everyone flew into the sky and headed straight for the exit of the secret realm. Their figures quickly disappeared into the horizon. The three palace masters stood in the square in front of the palace and looked at their departing figures with complicated expressions. The third palace master and the fourth palace master felt that it was a pity, and their eyes were filled with regret. However, the second palace master's expression regained its dignity, and his eyes became clear and cold. He suddenly said in a deep voice, "Fourth brother, immediately take a group of elite guards and quietly rush to Seven Moon Mountain." Hearing those words, the third palace master and the fourth palace master were both stunned. Their expressions were somewhat astonished. Second palace master, why did you suddenly make this decision? Second palace master, why are you doing this? Appease the people of Qingyu Hall? Punish the master of Qingyu Hall? Or are you guarding against the revenge of the Prajna God Emperor? The second hall master said with an indifferent expression, all three. Later, the first hall master will draft a decree to punish the master of Qingyu Hall. When the time comes, you will personally bring the decree to Seven Moon Mountain and settle the matter before coming back. The fourth palace master was silent and accepted the task. However, the third palace master asked with confusion, Second palace master, appeasing the people of Seven Moon Mountain and punishing the master of Qingyu Hall is understandable. Guarding against the revenge of the Prajna God Emperor? It doesn't seem necessary, right? Didn't she just say it? She knows how powerful the Kongming Temple is and she won't seek her own death. Haha. The second palace master twitched the corner of his mouth and sneered, "You don't know this woman, so you underestimated her. Based on my understanding of her personality, she won't be able to take this lying down. In front of us she's just temporarily suppressing and pretending. When she returns to Seven Moon Mountain, she'll definitely deal with the Qingyu Hall and avenge her soldiers. This woman looks cold and wise and she won't do anything irrational. But in reality she's not as cold as she looks. She'll still have emotional fluctuations and she'll have weaknesses and flaws." The third palace master and the fourth palace master looked at each other, and the same thought flashed through their minds. Why didn't I see it before? The second palace master has studied women's minds. But no matter what, the second palace master was so determined and insisted that the fourth palace master bring a group of elite guards to Seven Moon Mountain. The fourth palace master could only obey. At the same time, the Prajna God Emperor left the Kongming realm with godly King Qixia and the others. They rode on the divine ship and flew across the sky at lightning speed, heading straight for Seven Moon Mountain. Godly King Qixia was in charge of controlling the divine ship, while the Prajna God Emperor sat in the control room, looking ahead expressionlessly. She was analyzing many clues in her mind. Although she hadn't said anything about this, she had many questions in her heart. Things had developed to this point, which was beyond her expectations and made her feel suspicious. She still couldn't believe that the 15,000 people of the Pure Moon Hall could fight against her fleet for such a long time and cause so many soldiers to die. There must be something wrong here. However, she had to go back in person. Only after an actual investigation could she find out the clues and clues. Godly King Qixia saw that his master was silent, so he took the initiative to speak. "Master, what do you plan to do next? Are we really going to swallow this insult and lead our soldiers away from Kongming Temple's territory? The Kongming Temple's territory is too big. Even if we travel for half a year without rest, we might not be able to go around it." The Prajna God Emperor collected her thoughts and snorted. She said in a cold voice, "Our soldiers are severely injured, so we should focus on recovery first. As for leaving Kongming Temple's territory, we will of course leave. But that will have to wait until I've dealt with Qingyu Hall." She had brought 100,000 of her most elite soldiers and entered the planet of origin. She had wanted to achieve great things. In the end, he was defeated before he even had the chance to display any of his methods and ambitions. He had truly died before he could even achieve victory. How could she not hate the master of Qingyu Hall? How could she forgive Qingyu Hall? Godly King Qixia nodded and said firmly, "That's right. We need to conserve our energy before we seek revenge on Qingyu Hall. Otherwise, Those tens of thousands of soldiers who died will not be able to rest in peace. No matter how powerful Kongming Temple is, we will not yield. She paused for a moment and asked, Master, I see that you have been deep in thought. Is there something else behind this matter? The Prajna God Emperor looked at her and nodded. Master's years of teaching you were not in vain. You also saw the clues? Godly King Xia nodded quickly. Ever since I received the news, I felt that it was strange. I still can't figure it out. The master of Qingyu Hall gathered 15,000 elites to fight with our 90,000 soldiers. Even though Qingyu Hall has the protection of a powerful divine weapon, they do not have much experience in fighting. How could they cause such heavy losses to us? There must be something wrong here. I even suspect that the godly temple of